Hey there and welcome back. If you are settling in now, drawing the covers a little higher, letting the day's frets begin to loosen and recede, letting the breath go out a little longer than it went in, then good. Because the story I want to tell you tonight is one of the great Edwardian life stories. It is the story of a woman whose name in 1895 was on the front page of every newspaper in the English-speaking world, whose marriage was the social event of the decade in two countries, whose subsequent unhappiness was a matter that the public read about in different forms for the next quarter of a century, and whose eventual escape from the cage that her wedding had built around her became in its own way one of the more satisfying long narratives that the late Victorian and Edwardian eras produced. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you, and if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. She was, by general agreement of the historians and the journalists and the gossips of her century, the most famous of the women who came to be called dollar princesses. Tonight, we are going to walk through her entire life. We are going to begin in the New York of 1877, in the upper bedroom of a brownstone on Fifth Avenue, where she was born to a branch of the Vanderbilt Railroad fortune. We are going to walk through the strange controlled childhood that her mother arranged for her in the great houses of New York and Newport. We are going to follow her to Europe at 16. We are going to watch her at 17 fall in love with the wrong man. We are going to watch her mother, by methods that the modern reader will find genuinely shocking, force her at 18 into a marriage with a man she did not love. We are going to follow her to England, to the great palace of Blenheim, where she lived miserably for the next decade as the Duchess of Marlborough. We are going to watch her slowly find her feet inside an unhappy marriage and become, by her late 20s, one of the more effective political wives and philanthropic figures in Edwardian London. We are going to watch the marriage end, by separation in 1906 and by divorce in 1921. We are going to watch her at last marry the man she actually loved, a French aviation pioneer called Jacques Bolson, and live with him for 35 years in a marriage that, by every account, made the first one look like a nightmare she had eventually woken from. We are going to follow her through the Second World War, when she and Jacques fled occupied France for America. We are going to watch her, at 75, sit down in her drawing room in Long Island and write the memoir that became the source for everything that has subsequently been said about her. And we are going to leave her, at the end, in the long final years of her widowhood, until her death at 87 in 1964, when she was buried, by her own express wish, in the village churchyard at Bladen, beside the gates of the great palace from which she had once spent 10 years trying to escape. It is a long life. It is the sort of life that the late 19th and early 20th centuries occasionally produced, when the collisions of money and class and ambition and family and love and the closing pressures of an entire era's social arrangements all happen to converge on one person. We are going to take it slowly. Settle in. We have time. I want to spend a moment, before we go to the brownstone in 1877, with the larger phenomenon of which Consuelo's life became the most famous case. The phrase dollar princess was a popular journalistic term, used loosely on both sides of the Atlantic from roughly the 1880s onward, to describe a kind of transatlantic marriage that had become, by the closing decades of the 19th century, one of the recognized institutions of the wealthy world. The marriage in question was the marriage of an American heiress to a member of the British or European aristocracy. The arrangement was, in its bare outlines, a transaction. The American heiress brought the money. The aristocrat brought the title and the country house and the social position. The mothers on both sides arranged the introduction. The contracts were negotiated through lawyers. The wedding, when it occurred, was held in the bride's country, with the maximum of public attention, and was followed by the bride's relocation to her husband's country, where she would spend the rest of her life in the social position that the title and the marriage had bought her. The phenomenon had, like most social phenomena, a set of historical conditions that produced it. On the American side, the post-Civil War economic expansion had produced an enormous new class of extremely wealthy industrial and commercial families. Railroads, steel, oil, banking, mining, these had generated, between roughly 1865 and 1900, fortunes of a scale that had never previously existed in the United States. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Goulds, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Whitneys, the Fricks, each of these families had by 1890 accumulated wealth that was, in absolute terms, the equivalent of kingdoms. The daughters of these families were, accordingly, heiresses of an order of magnitude that had not previously existed. They were also, by virtue of being American and new, subject to ambiguity in the existing social hierarchies of New York and Newport, the old established New York families. The Astors, the Schuylers, the Van Rensselaers, the Stuyvesants had spent the previous generation drawing the social lines tighter against the new industrial wealth. The mothers of the new heiresses were, in many cases, women who had grown up genteel but not rich, who had married money in the boom years, and who were now finding that their daughter's position in New York society was being defined for them by hostesses whose grandfathers had been merchants in the same town 100 years earlier. The American social hierarchy was, in this sense, working against them, and on the English side the conditions were almost the inverse. The English aristocracy in 1880 was beginning a long economic decline that the agricultural depression of the 1870s and the concurrent collapse in agricultural rents had set in motion. The great country estates that had supported the aristocratic families since the Middle Ages were, by the 1880s, costing more to maintain than they were earning in income. The houses themselves, in many cases, had been substantially rebuilt or expanded in the 18th and early 19th centuries to a scale that the family fortunes were no longer capable of supporting. The taxation of the landed estates was slowly increasing. The political position of the aristocracy was, in the long liberal conservative struggle of the late Victorian era, beginning to weaken. The whole apparatus of the country house and the entailed estate and the inherited title was, by the closing decades of the 19th century, in the early stages of a decline that the next several decades would deepen considerably. What the English aristocracy needed in this situation was money. What it had to offer, in exchange for money, was the one thing the new American wealth conspicuously lacked, which was social position. The trade was, accordingly, set up. The first famous Anglo-American marriages of the trade in this form occurred in the 1870s. Jenny Jerome of New York married Lord Randolph Churchill in 1874, becoming, in due course, the mother of Winston Churchill. Consuelo Yznega of Cuban-American descent married the future Duke of Manchester in 1876. The trade quickened through the 1880s. By the early 1890s, it was a recognized fact of transatlantic life. By the time of Consuelo Vanderbilt's marriage in 1895, the rate had reached perhaps a dozen such marriages a year, with the more spectacular cases attracting the type of newspaper coverage that the modern reader would associate with the marriages of film stars or royalty. The trade would continue at a slower pace until the First World War, by which time the original conditions had begun to shift. By the time of the war's end in 1918, the great age of the dollar princess was substantially over. The total number of such marriages in the half-century between 1870 and 1920 was somewhere between 300 and 400. The exact figure depends on how the term is defined, but the order of magnitude is settled. Of these 300 or 400 marriages, some were happy, some were tolerably content, some were unhappy, a number were catastrophic. The famous historian Marion Fowler, who wrote the standard study of the phenomenon, found that the rate of unhappy marriages among the dollar princesses was, as one might expect, somewhat higher than the rate among the comparable population of marriages within either country, but not as catastrophically higher as the popular memory of the trade has tended to suggest. The popular memory has, however, fixated on certain cases, and the case it has fixated on most prominently is Consuelo Vanderbilt's. Her marriage was the largest in financial scale of any of the dollar princess marriages. It was the most public. It was unhappy in ways that the conventions of the era prevented her from saying directly until decades later, and it produced, eventually, the most famous and most carefully written memoir that any of the dollar princesses left behind. The combination has made her, in retrospect, the iconic figure of the entire trade. When the phrase dollar princess is used, in any modern context, the implicit reference is, first and most often, to Consuelo Vanderbilt. So let us go back. The Vanderbilt family, in 1877, was at the very top of the new American wealth that the post-war industrial expansion had been producing. The fortune had been founded by the patriarch Cornelius Vanderbilt, known throughout his long working life as the Commodore. He had been born in 1794 on Staten Island to a Dutch farming family of modest means, had begun his working life at 16 running a ferry between Staten Island and Manhattan, had built up over the next 40 years a substantial steamship business, and had then, in his 60s, switched his entire investment into the new railroad industry that was, in the years after the Civil War, transforming the American economy. By the time of his death in January 1877, 2 months before Consuelo was born, the Commodore had assembled the New York Central Railroad system, which controlled the principal rail lines between New York and Chicago, and had become, by general agreement, the single richest man in the United States. His estate at his death was valued at approximately $100 million, which in modern terms, accounting for the dramatic shift in what wealth could buy in 1877 versus today, was somewhere between $3 and $5 billion. The estate was substantially larger than the federal government's annual budget at the time. It was, at the moment of his death, almost certainly the largest fortune in the world. The Commodore had left almost the entire fortune to his eldest son, William Henry Vanderbilt, who continued and expanded the family's railroad interests for the next 8 years until his own death in 1885. William Henry was an able businessman who almost doubled the fortune in his 8 years as its head. At his death, he in turn divided the fortune principally between his 2 eldest sons. The elder of the 2 was Cornelius Vanderbilt II, a serious and rather Puritan figure who built the great Newport house called the Breakers and lived, by Vanderbilt standards, a relatively life devoted to the family business and to philanthropy. The younger of the 2 was William Kissam Vanderbilt, known to the family and the newspapers as Willie K. And it was to William Kissam Vanderbilt and his wife that Consuelo was born on the 2nd of March, 1877. William Kissam Vanderbilt was, in his 31st year at the moment of his daughter's birth, a man of considerable charm and limited ambition. He had grown up in the immense wealth that the Commodore had created, and that his father William Henry was steadily expanding, and he had developed a form of pleasant, uncomplicated personality that the children of large fortunes occasionally produce when no pressure is placed on them to make their own way. He worked, in a moderate way, in the family railroad businesses. He had a substantial interest in horse racing, which he indulged with a version of expenditure that wealthy young men of his class had developed into a science. He was a sailor, with an interest in yachts, which had been the family's earlier business, and which he had carried forward as a personal passion. He was, by every account that has come down to us, a kind man, an absent father, and a husband whose mild temperament was almost exactly the wrong match for the temperament of the woman he had married 6 years earlier. The woman in question was Alva Erskine Smith. She was the central figure of Consuelo's childhood, and the catastrophe of Consuelo's first marriage, and the central figure of the entire story we are about to walk through. We are going to spend a considerable amount of time with Alva, because Alva is the engine of everything that happens to Consuelo for the first 25 years of her life, and we cannot understand the daughter without first spending some time with the mother. Alva had been born in 1853 in Mobile, Alabama, the daughter of a moderately successful cotton merchant called Murray Smith. The family was Southern, Episcopalian, and reasonably comfortable, although by no means as wealthy as the Vanderbilts they would later marry into. Alva's father moved the family to Paris when she was a child, in part for business reasons, and in part because the cosmopolitan French environment was thought to be a better place to raise a daughter who was already showing the character of strong-willed temperament that her parents recognized would need handling. Alva spent the bulk of her childhood and adolescence in Paris and in New York, and she developed in those years the combination of European cultivation and American ambition that would, in due course, make her one of the most formidable social figures of her generation. She returned with her family to America during the Civil War, in increasingly straitened circumstances, as the war wrecked the cotton trade on which her father's wealth had depended. By the closing years of the war, the family was in financial difficulty. By the time of her father's death in 1869, when Alva was 16, the family was effectively impoverished. Alva, with her widowed mother and her sisters, had to make her own way in the New York that the Civil War's end had left them in. What Alva had to make her way with was, in summary, herself. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense. She was small, dark, with a square face and a determined jaw, and the shape of physical presence that registered as forceful rather than pretty. But she was extraordinarily intelligent. She was extraordinarily well educated by the standards of American girls of her era. She spoke French fluently, knew the European art world from her Paris years, had read more widely than any New York girl of her age. She had, most of all, an extremely clear understanding of how the social world operated, and a determination to position herself as advantageously within it as her circumstances would permit. She made, in her early 20s, the calculation that any number of intelligent, ambitious young women of the post-war American moment were making, that the path forward for a woman of her position and her resources was through the marriage market. She positioned herself, with the considerable help of various well-connected friends, in the overlapping social world of New York and Newport. She met William Kissam Vanderbilt in 1874. She married him in April of 1875. She was 22. He was 26. He was an heir to the largest fortune in America. She was, by the terms of her own marriage, now a Vanderbilt. The first child of the marriage, a son called William Kissam Vanderbilt II, was born in 1876. The second child was Consuelo. The third, a son called Harold Sterling Vanderbilt, was born in 1884. She was also, in the calculation that her mother had begun to develop almost from the moment of her birth, the principal piece in a long social game that the next 18 years would slowly construct around her. I want to spend a moment with the question of Consuelo's name, because the name is the first piece of evidence about what her mother was already planning. She was named for Consuelo Iznaga, who was Alva's closest friend and one of the early dollar princesses I mentioned in our opening. Consuelo Iznaga had married the future Duke of Manchester in 1876, the year before Consuelo Vanderbilt's birth, and had become, by 1877, the Viscountess Mandeville and the future Duchess of Manchester. Alva had been a bridesmaid at her wedding. The friendship between the two women was the closest of Alva's life. The naming of Alva's daughter for her friend was, at one level, a sentimental gesture. At another level, it was a first signal to anyone close enough to the family to register it that Alva had decided, before her daughter was a year old, that her daughter's destiny was to follow Consuelo Iznaga's. The name was in this sense a permanent reminder, audible every time the child was addressed, of what her mother had already begun to plan for her. The child grew up, accordingly, with a name that was also a program. The household into which Consuelo was born was, even by the standards of the new American wealth, an exceptionally large one. The 44th Street brownstone in which she was born was the family's first house, but Alva had already, in 1877, begun to lay the plans for the house that would replace it. The replacement house, when it was completed 5 years later, would become one of the most famous dwellings ever built in the United States. It stood at 665th Avenue, on the corner of 52nd Street, and it had been designed by the architect Richard Morris Hunt at Alva's request as a French Renaissance chateau in the Loire Valley style. The house was the size of a palace. It contained perhaps 50 rooms, with a great hall in carved limestone, a dining room that could seat 60, a ballroom on the second floor that could accommodate 1,000 dancers, and the sort of carved stonework and inlaid marble and frescoed ceilings that Hunt had assembled by importing French and Italian craftsmen for the duration of the construction. The house cost approximately $3 million to build in 1882, an astonishing sum, equivalent to perhaps $100 million in modern income terms, and it represented in its single self Alva's first major public statement about the position she intended the Vanderbilt family to occupy in the social world of New York. The reason for the statement was that the Vanderbilt family in 1882 did not yet occupy that position. The old New York social world was dominated in those years by Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, the wife of William Backhouse Astor Jr., who had become the unchallenged arbiter of who was admitted to the central core of New York society and who was not. Mrs. Astor's authority had been formalized by her social secretary Ward McAllister, who had developed the famous list of the 400 families he and Mrs. Astor considered to be the only true social elite of the city. The Vanderbilts, despite the immense scale of their wealth, were not on the list. The Commodore's origins as a Staten Island ferryman were considered, by Mrs. Astor's standards, too recent to qualify the family for admission. Alva had been told when she married into the family that the Vanderbilts were socially impossible. She had decided, almost from the moment of her marriage, that she would change this fact. The instrument by which she would change it was the great house she had Hunt build. The instrument was also the great party she gave to inaugurate the house. The party in question, Alva's costume ball of the 26th of March, 1883, was the single most famous entertainment in the history of New York to that point, and it was the event that broke the Astor monopoly and forced the established New York society to admit the Vanderbilts to its inner circle. The story of the ball is one of the better-known pieces of Gilded Age legend, and the story is worth telling because it tells us a great deal about the type of woman who was 6 years after Consuelo's birth, in the middle of arranging the family's social position with a calculation that the modern reader will recognize as, at minimum, formidable. The ball was planned to be held on the 26th of March, 1883, as the inaugural event of the new house. Alva had announced it months in advance. The invitations had been issued. The costume requirements, every guest was to come in an elaborate fancy dress costume, had been published in the society columns. The whole of New York's wealthy was preparing for the event with a form of feverish dressmaking and tailoring that such things required. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie Astor, who was at this time 17, had been preparing an elaborate costume for a star quadrille that several of the younger women had been planning to perform at the ball. Carrie was practicing the quadrille with her friends. The dress had been ordered, the shoes had been bought. Carrie was, in every meaningful sense, planning to attend. There was, however, a problem. Alva had not received Carrie or her mother on the standard reciprocal social calls that New York society required as the basis of its mutual recognition. Mrs. Astor had not, in the 8 years of Alva's marriage, paid the first call on Alva that would have admitted her to the Astor circle. The reason for the omission was, on the formal level, that Mrs. Astor did not consider the Vanderbilts to be socially eligible for the call. The practical effect of the omission was that Alva, by the strict rules of the era, was not in a position to extend an invitation to Carrie Astor because she had not been formally introduced to the Astor family. Alva accordingly sent word to Mrs. Astor's house through her social secretary, as such things were handled, that she regretted that she could not invite Carrie to the ball because Mrs. Astor had not paid her the call. The pressure on Mrs. Astor was immediate. Carrie was distraught. The dress had been ordered. The quadrille had been practiced. The whole of the younger New York set was going to be at the ball, and Carrie's exclusion would be a public humiliation that the Astor family could not afford. Mrs. Astor was forced, after a period of internal calculation, to call on Alva. She did so. The invitation to Carrie was issued. The ball went forward as planned. The Astor monopoly had been broken. The ball itself was by every contemporary account the most spectacular entertainment New York had ever seen. There were perhaps 1,200 guests. The house was decorated with thousands of flowers brought up from the south for the purpose. The catering had been arranged by Delmonico's, the great New York restaurant of the era. The supper alone served at midnight to all 1,200 guests in the new dining room, and the great hall included quail, terrapin, fillet of beef, cold sturgeon, and an elaborate sequence of patisserie that the Delmonico chefs had prepared specially for the evening. The costumes were extraordinary. Alva herself appeared as a Venetian princess from a Renaissance painting, in a dress of pale yellow silk and gold brocade with a set of pearl and diamond ornaments that she had commissioned from Tiffany for the occasion. The various Vanderbilt cousins and brothers-in-law and sisters-in-law appeared in increasingly elaborate costumes. The star quadrille was performed at midnight. The dancing went on until 5 in the morning. The whole event was reported in the New York newspapers for the next several weeks. with a version of breathless detail that the era's society journalism reserved for its grandest occasions. When the ball was over, the Vanderbilts had been admitted to the inner circle of New York society. Alva had achieved in a single evening what she had set out 3 years earlier to achieve. Consuelo, the eldest daughter, was 6 years old. She had not, of course, attended the ball. She was a child, and the ball was for adults. But the household into which she had been born, and the campaign of which she would in due course become the central piece, had now been substantially advanced. The Vanderbilts were, as of the morning of the 27th of March 1883, where Alva had wanted them to be. The next phase of Alva's planning could now begin. The next phase of Alva's planning concerned the daughter. We are going to spend now a substantial portion of the story with the childhood and adolescence of Consuelo, because of the period in which Alva's plan was being executed in its most form, and the period in which the foundation of the catastrophe of the first marriage was being slowly laid. The childhood was, in its way, one of the more carefully controlled childhoods that the wealthy of the late 19th century produced, and the control of it was, we now understand from Consuelo's own memoir and from the various biographers who have studied the period, the single most consequential fact about her early life. Consuelo was, throughout her childhood, an exceptionally tall and exceptionally beautiful girl. She had her father's height. She would reach by adulthood somewhere close to 6 feet, which in the era of women who averaged perhaps 5 feet 3 made her conspicuously tall. She had her mother's dark hair and her mother's strong jaw, but her face had been softened by the genetic combination of the two parents into something genuinely lovely. Her eyes were brown. Her bearing was, from a very young age, the carriage of someone who had been trained to hold herself well. Her temperament was an observant and intelligent. She was, from the early observations of the governesses and the family friends who recorded their impressions, a thoughtful child, serious, anxious, with the wary alertness that children of strong-willed parents often develop. She watched, she observed, she listened. She did, on the whole, what her mother told her to do. Her mother told her to do a great deal. The childhood that Alva arranged for Consuelo was, by the standards of any era and any class, a program of intensive preparation. There were governesses from the age of 3. There were languages. Consuelo learned French as a child, German by perhaps 8, Italian in her early teens. There were music lessons. There were drawing lessons. There were dancing lessons. There were riding lessons. There were the lessons in deportment and manners and conversation that Alva considered the foundation of her daughter's future. There was, beginning at perhaps the age of 7, the iron back brace. The iron back brace is a detail that has come down through Consuelo's own memoir, and through the various biographers who have followed her. It was in form a metal frame of rods and straps that Consuelo was required to wear during her lessons, with the explicit purpose of forcing her to maintain the upright carriage that Alva considered essential to her future deportment. The brace ran from the base of the spine up the back to the shoulders and around the front to the chest, with rods extending up the back of the neck to ensure that the head was held in the correct position. It was uncomfortable. It was, by the standards of the modern reader's understanding of childhood, somewhat extreme, but it produced, by the time Consuelo was a teenager, the famously beautiful upright carriage that the photographs of her later life invariably display. And Alva considered the discomfort an entirely acceptable price for the result. Consuelo wore the brace, in some form or another, for several years of her childhood. The lasting physical effect was the upright bearing. The lasting psychological effect Consuelo would later write with the character of restraint that her memoir habitually employed was a complicated relationship with her own body and her mother. There was also the riding crop. The riding crop is the other detail that Consuelo's memoir preserves, and it has come down, with the back brace, as one of the canonical pieces of evidence about Alva's methods. Alva, when Consuelo's lessons were not going to her satisfaction, would, on occasion, strike Consuelo with a riding crop on the legs or the back. The strikes were not in any modern sense. An extreme form of physical punishment, corporal punishment of children, was widespread in the period, and the strikes were not heavy enough to cause lasting injury, but they were a permanent feature of the educational regime that Alva had instituted, and they were, in their way, one of the permanent reminders that the relationship between mother and daughter was a relationship of authority rather than of straightforward affection. Consuelo, in her memoir, described her childhood feeling toward her mother as a combination of love and fear, with the fear, on the whole, predominating. The houses in which the childhood was conducted are part of the story, and I want to spend a moment with them. The principal residence was the Fifth Avenue Chateau that Alva had built for the 1883 ball, and it was the family's main address from 1882 onward. The summer residence, until 1892, was a smaller cottage in Newport called the Idle Hour. From 1892 onward, the summer residence was the great Newport house called Marble House, which Alva had had Richard Morris Hunt build for her on a scale that exceeded even the Fifth Avenue Chateau. Marble House, which still stands today and is one of the most visited of the Newport mansions, was built between 1888 and 1892 at a cost of approximately $11 million. Of which $7 million was for the marble alone, 500,000 cubic feet of white marble imported from Italy, with the various coloured marbles imported from elsewhere in Europe. The house was given to Alva by her husband as a 39th birthday present in 1892. It was decorated in an adaptation of the Petit Trianon at Versailles, in pale gold and pink and white, with the great marble entrance hall and the gold ballroom and the dining room in pink marble and gilt, and the various smaller rooms in the 18th century French taste. The house was the size of a substantial public museum. It had perhaps 50 rooms. It was occupied by the family for perhaps 8 weeks each summer. The remainder of the year it was closed up under the care of a permanent staff of 15 chaplets. There was a third major residence, the family's Long Island estate, also called Idle Hour, on the South Shore at Oakdale. There were the various smaller properties that the Vanderbilt connections produced, the brother-in-law's Newport house, the cousin's Long Island place, the various uncles' establishments in the city and the country. There was, in summary, an archipelago of Vanderbilt residences within which the family circulated through the year, and within which Consuelo's childhood was conducted with the program of governesses and lessons and back braces and riding crops that her mother had arranged. The friends, in the conventional sense, were almost entirely absent from the childhood. Alva did not encourage Consuelo to develop friendships with girls of her own age. The reasoning, Alva later acknowledged in conversations with her own friends, was that Consuelo's destiny was not to be the wife of a New York banker or a Boston lawyer, in which cases friendships with girls of similar position would have been useful, but to be the wife of a European aristocrat, in which case the New York and Newport girls were essentially irrelevant to her future life. Consuelo was, accordingly, kept somewhat apart from the social world of the daughters of the New York rich. She had a few friendships with cousins and with the daughters of her mother's friends, but the deep adolescent friendships that most girls of her class formed in their teenage years and carried forward into their adult lives. Those friendships were, by Alva's deliberate arrangement, not part of the structure of her daughter's life. Consuelo grew up accordingly, somewhat lonely. She had her brothers, with whom she was reasonably close. She had her governesses. She had her father, who was kind to her in his absent way, and who occasionally took her sailing on his yacht. But the accumulating peer society that most adolescents construct around themselves was, in her case, not constructed. There was, however, one element of Consuelo's adolescent world that was carefully constructed by her mother, and that was her relationship with the European nobility. Alva had begun, by the time Consuelo was 10 or 11, to take her on regular visits to Europe, to England, to France, to Germany, for the explicit purpose of introducing her to the European aristocratic world that her future would in due course place her in. The trips were carefully planned. The houses they visited were carefully chosen. The introductions Alva arranged were carefully calibrated. By the time Consuelo was 12 or 13, she had been presented to perhaps 24 of the more important European aristocratic families. By the time she was 15, she had been considered for, in the discussions that her mother conducted with the various European mothers, perhaps half a dozen possible matches. By the time she was 16, the field had been narrowed to 2 or 3 serious candidates. The whole process of this informal preparation was, in its way, the rough European equivalent of the formal arranged marriage negotiations that other cultures conducted more openly. The daughter was being prepared, slowly and carefully, for the disposal her mother had been planning since her birth. Consuelo was aware, in the broad outlines, of what was being prepared. She was an intelligent girl, and the intelligence she had been showing since childhood made her perfectly capable of understanding what the European introductions and the conversations and the gradual narrowing of the field of possible matches actually meant. She was not, however, in any meaningful sense able to resist. The combination of her mother's dominant personality, her own conditioned obedience, the absence of any peer support from friends or other relatives, and her general lack of any other prospects, all of this combined by the time she was 16 into a situation in which Consuelo was substantially powerless to direct her own future. She knew what was coming. She could not, by any means at her disposal, prevent it. There was, however, one development in Consuelo's adolescence that briefly threatened the arrangement her mother was constructing. The development took the form of a young American man called Winthrop Rutherford, and the story of Consuelo's love for him is the near escape that her life almost made before the cage closed completely. Winthrop Rutherford was, in 1894, 22 years old. He came from one of the older New York families. The Rutherfords had been in New York since the Dutch period, were related by marriage to the Stuyvesants and the Schuylers, and represented the shape of old established American social position that the Vanderbilts had spent the previous decade buying their way into. Winthrop himself was tall, fair-haired, athletic, intelligent, and considered by the Society of the New York Young one of the most eligible bachelors of his generation. He was a graduate of Columbia. He was a sportsman of considerable distinction, a polo player of national rank, an excellent tennis player, an accomplished horseman. He was also, by the various contemporary descriptions that have come down to us, a man of unusually pleasant temperament and considerable personal charm. He met Consuelo at some point in the early 1890s at one of the dinners that the New York wealthy circulated their unmarried young people through during the season. He was struck by her. She, very quickly, was struck by him. The relationship developed slowly. Consuelo, by this time perhaps 16, was permitted by her mother to attend a number of dinners and dances at the houses of trusted family friends in the sort of carefully chaperoned situations that the era's protocols required. Winthrop was present at several of these. The two young people danced together. They spoke. They exchanged the conversation that the protocol of the era permitted between unmarried young people. By the spring of 1894, when Consuelo was 17, the relationship had developed into the type of romantic understanding that, in any ordinary family, would have led toward an engagement. Alva was aware of the developing relationship. She was not, at first, alarmed by it. Winthrop was a perfectly suitable match by American standards: old family, considerable personal fortune, excellent prospects, irreproachable character. If Consuelo had been being prepared for the standard New York or Boston marriage, Winthrop would have been, in fact, an entirely satisfactory candidate. But Consuelo was not being prepared for the standard American marriage. She was being prepared for the European aristocratic marriage that Alva had been planning for 17 years. Winthrop, in this calculation, was not a possibility. He was an obstacle. In the summer of 1894, the Vanderbilt family went, as they always did, to Newport for the summer season. Marble House had been completed 2 years earlier, and the summer of 1894 was the third summer in which the family was occupying it as their principal summer residence. Winthrop, who was a member of the Newport summer set, was also there. The relationship between Consuelo and Winthrop continued in the Newport version of their New York acquaintance. There were tennis parties. There were dinners. There were, on at least one occasion, the conversations between the two of them that the gardens of Marble House, when Alva was occupied with her own social engagements, briefly permitted. The proposal, when it came in August of 1894. Winthrop, who had been calculating the moment for several weeks, asked Consuelo to marry him. She accepted. The acceptance was, in the moment in which it was given, the single decisive act of self-direction that her 17-year-old life had so far produced. She told him she would marry him. Winthrop, who was no fool, understood that the persuasion of Alva would be the difficult part of the situation, but he believed Consuelo's commitment to him, and he believed that the combination of Consuelo's determination and his own social standing would, between them, eventually produce the marriage they wanted. He left Newport at the end of August, expecting the engagement to be made public in due course. The engagement was not made public in due course. What happened instead was the most concentrated period of psychological pressure of Consuelo's life, and the period in which Alva's methods, which had previously operated as the background structure of her daughter's existence, became the foreground crisis of an open struggle between mother and daughter that lasted, with increasing intensity, for the next 14 months. Consuelo, when she returned from Newport to New York in September, told her mother about Winthrop's proposal. She told her that she intended to marry him. She asked, in how she had been trained over 17 years to address her mother, for her mother's consent. The consent was not given. What was given instead was a sustained and varied campaign of refusal that the modern reader will find, even by the standards of 19th century maternal authority, genuinely shocking. The first stage of the campaign was the formal refusal. Alva told Consuelo, in plain language, that she would not consent to the marriage to Winthrop Rutherford, that she did not consider Mr. Rutherford an appropriate match, and that the proposal would not be accepted. Consuelo, who had been trained for 17 years to obey her mother, but who had now invested her own emotional commitment in the relationship with Winthrop, refused to break the engagement. The first stage of the refusal had failed. The second stage of the campaign was the practical separation. Alva, with her customary efficiency, took steps to ensure that Consuelo and Winthrop could not communicate with one another. The letters that Winthrop sent to Consuelo were intercepted and destroyed. The visits that Winthrop attempted to make to the Fifth Avenue house were turned away at the door by the staff, who had been instructed not to admit him. The whole apparatus of the household was deployed to ensure that the lovers could not, by any ordinary means of communication, reach one another. Consuelo, who had not been permitted to develop a form of independent social network that would have allowed her to circumvent the household, found herself isolated. She wrote letters that did not reach Winthrop. He wrote letters that did not reach her. She had, in the practical sense, been cut off. The third stage of the campaign was the most extreme. Alva, recognizing that the refusal and the separation were not, by themselves, producing Consuelo's surrender, escalated the pressure into the realm of the personal. She told Consuelo, in a series of conversations that took place over the autumn and winter of 1894 and the early months of 1895, that she had a serious heart condition that her doctor had told her would be aggravated by any continued strain. She told Consuelo that if Consuelo persisted in the engagement, the strain on her mother's health would be such that her mother might not survive it. The implication was unmistakable. If Consuelo married Winthrop, her mother might die. The death would be Consuelo's fault. Alva, in the conversations that she conducted with her daughter on this point over the course of those months, was extremely effective. The daughter, who had been raised for 17 years to believe that the welfare of her mother was the central organizing principle of her existence, was being told that her own happiness would, if pursued, kill her mother. Alva also, during the same period, made a threat about Winthrop himself. The exact form of the threat varies in the various accounts that have come down to us, but the substance is consistent. Alva, on at least one occasion, told Consuelo that if Consuelo persisted in the engagement, she would arrange for Winthrop to be physically harmed. The threat was probably not literal. Alva was not, in any practical sense, in a position to arrange for the assassination of a young man of Winthrop Rutherford's social standing, but the threat was made with sufficient apparent seriousness that Consuelo, who was 17 and frightened, and had been substantially isolated from any other source of emotional support, took it seriously. The combination of the threat to Alva's life by the engagement and the threat to Winthrop's was, by Alva's calculation, sufficient to break Consuelo's resistance. The calculation was correct. Consuelo broke. The exact moment of the breaking is hard to date, because the various accounts differ slightly, but by the spring of 1895, perhaps March or April, Consuelo had agreed to break the engagement to Winthrop and to accept whatever marriage her mother arranged. The agreement was given in the conversation between mother and daughter that had been, for the previous 6 months, the principal recurring event of Consuelo's life. Consuelo wept. She agreed. She wrote, at her mother's instruction, the letter to Winthrop in which she ended the engagement. The letter was sent. The relationship was over. Consuelo, at 18, had surrendered the one piece of her own future that she had ever attempted to claim. The aftermath of the surrender was, as Alva had always intended it to be, the beginning of the next phase of the project. With Consuelo's resistance broken, Alva could now turn to the actual business of the European marriage that she had been preparing for the previous 17 years. She had a candidate. The candidate had been, in fact, identified in the European discussions of the previous several years, and the negotiations had been quietly underway since the previous summer. The candidate was the 9th Duke of Marlborough, and his name will now become the central name in the next decade of Consuelo's life. I want, before we go to the Duke himself, to make an observation about the 14 months between Winthrop's proposal in August 1894 and the wedding to the Duke in November 1895. The 14 months are, in some sense, the period in which the entire crime of the affair was committed, and the period in which the ground was prepared for the unhappiness that the next 25 years would slowly unfold. Alva, in those 14 months, broke her daughter's spirit in a way that the daughter herself acknowledged, in her later memoir, had taken her decades to recover from. The breaking was done with Alva's customary efficiency, and Alva herself, for the rest of her own life, would alternate between defending what she had done and occasionally expressing the regret that the older Alva of the 1920s would eventually express. We will come, in due course, to the older Alva and to the remarkable acknowledgement of her error that she made in 1926. But the breaking of 1894 to 1895 was, at the time and for many years afterward, complete. Consuelo entered the marriage to the Duke of Marlborough as a defeated person, and the defeat was, by her mother's deliberate construction, the foundation of her wedded life. The 9th Duke of Marlborough was, in the spring of 1895, 23 years old. His full name was Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, and he was the head of one of the great ducal houses of England. The Dukedom of Marlborough had been created in 1702 for the first Duke, John Churchill, the great military commander whose victories in the War of the Spanish Succession against Louis XIV had made him, in his own lifetime, one of the most celebrated soldiers in English history. The first Duke had been granted, by a grateful nation in 1705, the manor of Woodstock in Oxfordshire, on which Queen Anne and Parliament had agreed to construct, at the public expense, a great palace as a monument to his victories. The palace was Blenheim, named for the first Duke's most famous battle. The palace had been designed by John Vanbrugh, was constructed between 1705 and 1722, and was, in its scale and grandeur, perhaps the largest non-royal residence ever built in England. It had been the seat of the Marlborough Dukes for the previous 200 years. The 9th Duke had succeeded to the title in November 1892, on the death of his father, the 8th Duke. He was at that point 21 years old. He had been at Cambridge, had not distinguished himself there, and had been, by the standards of the young Edwardian aristocrat, a perfectly ordinary heir. He was in stature about 5 feet 6, considerably shorter than Consuelo would prove to be when they met slender, with a precise face and a precise manner. He had a stutter. He was not a social man. He was reserved, formal, with a strong sense of his own ducal dignity and a fierce attachment to Blenheim Palace and to the Marlborough family inheritance. His nickname, which had attached itself to him in childhood, and which he carried for the rest of his life, was Sunny, not because he had a sunny disposition, which by all accounts he did not, but because his courtesy title before his accession to the dukedom had been Earl of Sunderland, and Sunny was the affectionate diminutive of Sunderland that the family had used. The Duke's problem when he succeeded to the title in 1892 was that the Marlborough estate was in serious financial difficulty. The 7th and 8th Dukes had, between them, substantially mismanaged the family fortune. The 8th Duke Inn had been a disaster. He had divorced his first wife in 1883, in a scandal that had excluded him from court society for years, had remarried to an American widow whose money he had largely spent, and had died at 52, leaving the estate substantially encumbered with debts. The agricultural depression that I mentioned earlier, which had been undermining the income of the great English estates since the late 1870s, had hit Blenheim with severity because the Marlborough estate was almost entirely dependent on agricultural rents that had fallen by perhaps 40% in the previous 15 years. The palace itself, which required an enormous staff to maintain and was costing in 1892 perhaps £30,000 a year merely to keep open, was, by the time of the 9th Duke's succession, a substantial financial drain on the family's diminishing income. The Duke, when he took stock of his inheritance in 1892 and 1893, recognised that he had to do something dramatic to prevent the Marlborough fortune from collapsing entirely. What the Duke decided to do was to marry an American heiress. The decision was not, by the standards of the Anglo-American marriage market that had developed in the previous 2 decades, an unusual one. Several of the great English houses had, by 1893, taken the same step. The Duke of Manchester had married Consuelo in 1876. Lord Randolph Churchill, the Duke of Marlborough's uncle, yes, the same uncle, had married Jenny Jerome in 1874. The future Duke of Roxburghe would marry an American heiress in 1903. The Anglo-American marriage was, by the early 1890s, a recognised solution to the financial difficulties of the great English houses, and the 9th Duke was simply, in choosing to make it, following an established pattern. The Duke, in 1893 and 1894, conducted a tour of the available American heiresses. The tour was conducted through the existing network of Anglo-American marriages. The various American mothers who had married English titles in the previous generation were active intermediaries in the introductions of the next generation, and the Duke's various cousins and aunts who had married into American families provided the channels through which the negotiations could be conducted. The Duke's aunt, who had been Mrs. Lily Hammersley, the American widow whom the 8th Duke had married, was active in the investigations of the available candidates. By the autumn of 1894, the candidate had been narrowed to Consuelo Vanderbilt. The reasons the candidate had been narrowed to Consuelo Vanderbilt were, on the side of the negotiations, almost entirely financial. Alva had been making clear, through her various intermediaries, that the dowry she was prepared to settle on her daughter was extraordinarily large by the standards of any of the previous dollar princess marriages. The dowry Alva was prepared to offer, if the right ducal title could be secured, was approximately $2.5 million American dollars in railroad stock, which was, in 1895, perhaps 18% of the entire combined valuation of the Marlborough estate, and which represented, in modern income terms, somewhere between $80 and $100 million in immediate liquid wealth. There was, in addition to the principal settlement, an annual income for the Duke of approximately $100,000, perhaps $4 million a year in modern income terms. The combination, when Alva made it clear that she was prepared to offer it, made Consuelo Vanderbilt by a substantial margin the most financially attractive heiress on the market. The Duke, who had inspected the field carefully, decided that Consuelo Vanderbilt was the candidate he would pursue. The Duke met Consuelo for the first time in the spring of 1894, in a brief encounter in London at a dinner that Alva had arranged through her European connections. The meeting was perfectly cordial, because such introductions were conducted, but it produced no romantic spark on either side. The Duke, who was at this point still privately involved with another young woman in England with whom he had been seriously in love for some time, was approaching the marriage as a financial transaction rather than as a romantic enterprise. Consuelo, who had not yet met Winthrop Rutherford at this point, was approaching the meeting with the dutiful attention that her mother had trained her to bring to such introductions. The two of them shook hands, They spoke briefly. The Duke retired. The introduction had served its purpose. The negotiations between Alva and the Duke's representatives continued through the autumn of 1894 and into the spring of 1895, the same autumn and spring during which Alva was conducting her campaign to break Consuelo's engagement to Winthrop. By the spring of 1895, when Consuelo's resistance was finally broken, the marriage settlement had been substantially agreed. The Duke would receive the $2.5 million in railroad stock with the additional annual income. He would in exchange marry Consuelo. The wedding would be held in New York in the autumn. The financial settlement would be paid on the day of the wedding. The Duke would then take Consuelo back to Blenheim, and the two of them would assume the position of the new Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. The Duke arrived in New York in late August of 1895, 4 months before the wedding, to conduct the final stages of the personal courtship that the social conventions of the era required. The courtship was conducted with the formality that the situation demanded. The Duke called on the Vanderbilt family at the Fifth Avenue house. He took Consuelo, with appropriate chaperones, to dinners and to the opera. He spent some weeks at Newport with the family in late August. He was, by every contemporary account, perfectly correct in his manner. He was also, by every contemporary account, almost entirely indifferent to Consuelo as a person. He spoke to her about Blenheim. He did not, in any of the recorded conversations of the courtship, speak to her about herself. He was, in his way, conducting the marriage as the financial transaction that everyone involved understood it to be, and the social courtesies of the courtship were, for him, the protocols required by the transaction rather than the expressions of any personal feeling. Consuelo, during the courtship, was substantially silent. She had not, since the surrender of the previous spring, attempted to alter the course of events. She accepted what was being arranged. She received the Duke when he called. She attended the dinners. She wore the dresses her mother had selected. She said the conventional things that the situation required. She was, by every account that has come down to us from that summer and autumn, in a state of profound despair that the social conventions of the era prevented her from expressing publicly. She was 18 years old. She was about to be married in less than 3 months to a man she did not love, in a country she had never lived in a position she had not chosen, for reasons that had been determined by her mother before she could remember. She did, as her mother required, what her mother required of her. The wedding date was set for the 6th of November 1895. The location was St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue, the great Gothic revival church that was the principal Episcopal church of the Vanderbilt social circle. The wedding party was assembled. The dress was ordered from the New York couturier Madame Donovan, in white satin and lace, with a veil of Point de Venise lace that had been specially ordered from Belgium for the occasion. The bridesmaids were chosen, 8 of them, including Consuelo's cousins and the few young women her mother considered appropriate. The wedding cake was ordered. The flowers, perhaps 12,000 pounds of flowers, more than had ever been used at any New York wedding, were arranged. The guest list ran to perhaps 3,000 names, although the church itself could only accommodate 2,500. The wedding presents, which began arriving in October, included a version of jewellery in silver and porcelain that the wedding gifts of 2 of the wealthiest families in their respective countries reliably produced. The whole apparatus of the wedding had been assembled, with Alva's customary efficiency, in the 4 months between the conclusion of the marriage settlement and the wedding day itself. There was, in the days immediately before the wedding, a final attempt at resistance. Consuelo, on the morning of the 6th of November, locked herself in her bedroom at the Fifth Avenue house and refused to come out. She had, in the despair of the night before, decided that she could not, after all, go through with the wedding. She had resolved, in the last stage of her crushed will, that she would refuse to dress for the ceremony, to attend, that the wedding would have to be cancelled. The resolution lasted perhaps 2 hours. Alva, who had not been informed by the household staff of the locked door for some time, eventually came up to the bedroom. She entered. She closed the door behind her. The conversation that followed has not been preserved in any account because no one but Consuelo and Alva was present, and Consuelo declined, in her later memoir, to record what was said. But after perhaps an hour, Consuelo emerged from the bedroom and went, with her mother, to the dressing room where the wedding dress was waiting. She allowed herself to be dressed. The wedding took place at noon. Consuelo, by every contemporary account, wept behind her veil throughout the ceremony. The veil concealed the weeping from the assembled guests, but the evidence of it, the downward turn of her shoulders, the tremor in her hand as she approached the altar, was visible to those close enough to observe it. The Duke, at the altar, conducted himself with his customary correctness. The vows were exchanged. The ring was placed. The marriage was solemnized. The recessional was played. The new Duke and Duchess of Marlborough walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Episcopal Church and out into the bright November afternoon of Fifth Avenue, where a crowd of perhaps several thousand spectators was waiting on the sidewalks to see them. Consuelo, in her bridal carriage with her new husband beside her, was driven to the wedding breakfast that Alva had arranged at the Fifth Avenue Chateau. The breakfast was, in its way, the formal closing of the 18-year-old project that Alva had been conducting since the daughter's birth. The marriage had been made. The transaction had been completed. The daughter had been disposed of, as planned, to the European aristocratic position for which she had been prepared since infancy. The new Duke and Duchess of Marlborough sailed for England that evening. The honeymoon would be conducted in part on the Atlantic crossing, and in part at various European stops on the way to Blenheim. The arrival at Blenheim was scheduled for early December, in time for the Christmas season that the great English country houses traditionally celebrated with considerable formality. The 18-year-old American girl was, on the evening of the 6th of November 1895, on a White Star Line steamer headed through the Atlantic toward the country, and the position and the marriage that her mother had arranged for her. She did not know the country. She did not love the man. She had not chosen the position. She was, in the despair of her own thoughts, beginning the next phase of her life with the resigned awareness that the next phase would be, by every indication available to her, considerably more difficult than the phase that had just ended. The arrival at Blenheim took place in early December of 1895. Consuelo, who had read about the palace in the various accounts that her mother had given her over the previous several years, was not unprepared for the scale of what she would find there. But the actual arrival, as she described it many years later in her memoir, was not entirely what she had expected. The palace, when she first saw it from the carriage as it came up the long drive from the village of Woodstock, was visible over the great park as a single enormous mass of gold-grey stone, set in a landscape of artificial lakes and planted woods that the great landscape gardener Capability Brown had designed in the 18th century. The mass of the palace was so substantial that even at a mile's distance, it did not look like a single building so much as like a fortified town. The drive curved through the park for perhaps another 20 minutes before the carriage drew up at the great court in front of the principal entrance, and Consuelo stepped down, with her husband, into the ceremonial reception that the household had arranged for her arrival. The reception was, in the tradition of the great English country house, extensive. The household staff, perhaps 60 servants in their full livery, had been assembled in the great court to greet the new Duchess. The senior staff, the butler, the housekeeper, the head gardener, the head gamekeeper, the chef, the head coachman, were lined up at the head of the row, with the more junior staff in descending order behind them. The vicar of the parish, who functioned as the household chaplain, was present to offer a formal welcome. The estate agent and his wife were present. The local gentry of the immediate neighbourhood, perhaps a dozen families, had been invited to present themselves at the dinner that evening. The whole apparatus of the great country house in formal welcoming mode had been deployed, and the 18-year-old American girl who was now the Duchess of Marlborough was being introduced, in the ceremonial way that the era required, to the staff and the neighbourhood and the social world that would now be the daily setting of her existence. She got through the reception. She greeted each of the senior staff by name, having been carefully briefed on the names and positions during the carriage ride from Woodstock. She accepted the bouquet that the head gardener's daughter presented. She thanked the vicar for his welcome. She walked, with her husband, through the great archway and into the entrance hall of the palace itself. The entrance hall of Blenheim is a single great room rising perhaps 60 feet through 3 stories of the building, with a painted ceiling by Sir James Thornhill depicting the first Duke's victory at Blenheim, and with the coats of arms of the various branches of the Marlborough family carved into the stone of the walls. The hall, in December, was extraordinarily cold. The fireplaces, although lit, made almost no impact on the volume of cold air that the great room contained. The Duchess of Marlborough, on the evening of her arrival at her new home, registered first, before any other impression, the cold. I want to spend some time with the cold, because the cold of Blenheim was, for the next 10 years of Consuelo's life, one of the principal physical conditions of her daily existence. The palace had been designed by Vanbrugh in the early 18th century, with the general English assumption that the principal living rooms would be heated by open fireplaces, and that the smaller rooms would be heated by smaller fireplaces. The system worked tolerably well in the 18th century, when the family lived in a relatively limited number of rooms, and the peripheral parts of the palace were often closed up. By the late 19th century, with the family in residence year-round in a larger number of rooms, and with the standards of comfort having shifted considerably from those of the previous era, the heating arrangements were substantially inadequate. The great rooms, the entrance hall, the saloon, the library, the great state dining room were essentially unheatable. The smaller rooms in which the family actually lived were heated by their fireplaces, but the corridors connecting them were not, and the daily traverse from the bedroom to the breakfast room, to the morning room, to the dining room, to the library, involved, for several months of the year, the crossing of a series of unheated corridors that were, in midwinter, only marginally warmer than the open air outside. Consuelo, who had grown up in the centrally heated houses of the New York and Newport Vanderbilts, found the cold of Blenheim a constant minor torment of her daily existence for the entire decade she lived there. The cold was, however, the obvious physical complaint. The deeper difficulties of her position were not physical. The deeper difficulties were social and personal, and they were going to require considerably more than additional firewood to resolve. The first of the deeper difficulties was the social position that the new Duchess found herself occupying. The Duchess of Marlborough was, by the accident of the dukedom's seniority in history, one of the highest-ranking women in English society. She was by precedence expected to be received at court. She was expected to play a formal role at the great occasions of the Marlborough family, the local hunts, the county functions, the political gatherings that the Duke would in due course be hosting at Blenheim. She was expected to be a substantial figure in London society during the seasons when the Duke and Duchess took up residence at the family's London house in Curzon Street. She was expected, in summary, to function as a duchess of one of the great English ducal houses at the close of the 19th century. She was 18 years old. She had been in England for less than 2 months. She did not know the social and political conventions in any detail. She was, in the practical sense, almost completely unprepared for the role that the marriage had assigned her. She set about the preparation in the methodical way that her childhood training had taught her. She studied the precedence books. She memorized the names of the principal English families and their seats and their connections. She learned the rules of court etiquette that her presentation at court would require. She practiced the carefully calibrated curtsies that the various ranks of court society called for. She was, by the standards of any reasonable assessment, a quick study. By the spring of 1896, when she made her first court appearance at Buckingham Palace, she had assembled a working competence in the role that the society pages of the London newspapers reliably found impressive. The reception at court was a success. She was, in the public way that the society pages required, launched as the new Duchess of Marlborough. The second of the deeper difficulties was the position of her marriage. The Duke, in the months of the honeymoon and the first months of the marriage, had been correct in his manner toward her, but had not, in any meaningful sense, been affectionate. He treated her with the courtesy that he treated his sisters and his female cousins. He did not seek her out for the pleasures that newly married couples seek each other out for. He did not, in any of the recorded behaviours of the early marriage, indicate that he had developed any feeling for her in the weeks since the wedding. The marriage was, on his side, the financial transaction it had always been. He had married her because he needed her dowry. The dowry had been paid. The transaction was complete. The continued daily presence of his wife was, for him, an obligation rather than a pleasure. He performed the obligation with the courtesy that his upbringing required, but he did not, in any meaningful sense, conceal the fact that the obligation was, for him, an obligation rather than a pleasure. Consuelo, who had married him without loving him, had not expected love from him, but she had expected perhaps a warmer version of the relationship that the marriage had created. The expectation, in the daily evidence of the early months of the marriage, proved to be unfounded. She found herself by the spring of 1896 married to a man who was civil to her but not affectionate, who shared her bed when the dynastic requirements of the marriage demanded it but not at any other time, who spoke to her about the management of the estate and the decisions of the household, but not about himself or his interior life, or any of the subjects that intimate marriage normally produces between its participants. The marriage in this sense was a formal arrangement of two people who lived in the same house and bore the same titles, but did not, in any deeper sense, know each other. The arrangement was, by the standards of arranged marriages within the English aristocracy from that era, not unusual. It was perhaps no worse than half of the arranged marriages of similar position, but it was the daily reality of Consuelo's life, and reality from which she would not, for the next 10 years, be able to escape. The dynastic obligation that I mentioned a moment ago produced, in due course, the two children whose existence is one of the fixed reference points of the story. The first of these was a son who was born on the 18th of September 1897, 22 months after the wedding. He was christened John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, the John for the founding first Duke, the Albert for the late Prince Consort, the Edward for the Prince of Wales who had agreed to be his godfather, the William for Consuelo's father William Kissam Vanderbilt. He was, by the title, that the heir of the dukedom held by courtesy, the Marquess of Blandford. He would, in due course, succeed to the dukedom on his father's death, becoming the 10th Duke of Marlborough. The second son was Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill, born on the 14th of October 1898, 13 months after his elder brother. He was the spare. The two of them, in the folk attribution that has come down through the various biographical accounts, are sometimes said to have been the original heir and a spare of the famous phrase. The phrase itself does not, as far as the historians have been able to establish, originate with Consuelo. It is a folk formulation that has attached itself to the Marlborough dynasty in retrospect, but the two boys did, in their fashion, occupy the roles that the phrase named. The first son secured the dynastic continuity of the dukedom. The second son secured the contingency in case of accident to the first. By 1898, when the second son was 13 months old, the dynastic obligation that the marriage had been contracted to satisfy was fully discharged. Consuelo had, by the standards of her contractual position, completed her principal duty as the Duchess of Marlborough. The remaining 66 years of her life would, in some sense, be the long working out of what one does with one's life after the principal obligation has been completed at the age of 21. I want to spend, before we leave the early years at Blenheim, a little time with the daily texture of Consuelo's life there in the years 1896 to perhaps 1900. The texture is part of the story, and the accumulated details of it tell us a good deal about what the position of Duchess of Marlborough actually consisted of in the closing years of the 19th century. The day at Blenheim began, for the Duchess, at perhaps 8 in the morning, when her lady's maid brought her morning tea and ran her bath. The dressing was an extended affair. Consuelo had, by 1896, the wardrobe of a great Edwardian duchess, which meant that the morning costume for a day in residence was the walking dress in tweed or wool that the country position required, with the appropriate boots and the appropriate hat for the morning's outdoor activity, with the jewellery that the morning required, with the hair dressed in the relatively simple morning arrangement. Breakfast was at 9, in the breakfast room that the family used for informal meals, served buffet-style from the sideboards by the footman, with the standard English country house breakfast kippers and bacon and eggs and toast and the porridge that the Scottish heritage of certain English country house traditions had introduced. The Duke, when he was in residence, was sometimes present at breakfast, and sometimes not. He had a habit, which he carried throughout his life, of taking his breakfast in his own dressing room when he was not inclined to social conversation, and the absence of him at breakfast was one of the recurring features of the Duchess's morning life. After breakfast, the Duchess attended to her correspondence. The post arrived at perhaps 10, and the volume of it was substantial. A duchess of one of the great houses received on an average day perhaps 30 or 40 letters, invitations to county functions, requests for charitable subscriptions, letters from the army of cousins and connections that the Marlborough family network produced, business communications about the estate and the various properties, the letters from her family in America. The correspondence took perhaps 2 hours. The Duchess wrote her replies in her own hand, on the heavy cream paper that the Marlborough family had been using for 2 centuries, with the family crest in dark blue at the head. The replies were sealed with the red wax and the family seal that the formal protocols of the era required. The correspondence was, in this sense, a substantial daily occupation, and the management of it was one of the recurring features of Consuelo's day after the correspondence. There was the morning consultation with the housekeeper. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Peary who had been at Blenheim for 30 years before Consuelo's arrival, came to the sitting room that the Duchess used for her morning office, and the two of them went through the daily decisions about the household. The menus for the day's meals were finalised. The assignments of the various housemaids to the various rooms were confirmed. The requirements for the evening, if there were guests for dinner, the preparations for the guest rooms, the additional services that the visit required, were arranged. The whole consultation took perhaps half an hour. The Duchess emerged from it with the confirmed sense of what the day's domestic apparatus would consist of, and the housekeeper carried back to the main staff areas the instructions that would govern the daily work of the perhaps 60 servants who maintained the establishment. The midday meal was at 1. Lunch at Blenheim, in the family's normal residential mode, was served in the breakfast room, in the same buffet style as the breakfast, with a more substantial set of dishes, typically a cold roast and a hot dish of some kind, with vegetables and a sweet course and cheese. The Duke, when present, sat at the head, the Duchess at the foot. Any guests in residence took the chairs along the sides. The conversation at lunch was the conversation of the country house, the morning's ride, the political news that the morning's papers had brought, the estate matters that had arisen since breakfast. The lunch took perhaps an hour. The afternoon was given over, in the standard country house pattern, to a varied set of activities. The Duke in the afternoon was usually shooting, or attending to the business of the estate, or away in Oxford or London on some piece of political or family business. The Duchess in the afternoon was generally engaged in some combination of riding, walking, paying calls on the local gentry, receiving callers at Blenheim, or attending to some piece of charitable work in the surrounding villages. The riding was substantial. Consuelo was a good horsewoman, having had the riding lessons in childhood that her mother's programme had included, and she rode out on most afternoons of decent weather. The calls on the local gentry were an institution of the country position. There were perhaps a dozen substantial families within easy carriage distance of Blenheim, and the reciprocal calls between the various households were one of the structures of the social life of the area. The receiving of callers at Blenheim was the equivalent activity in reverse, with the various local families calling on the Duchess in her sitting room over the course of the afternoon. The charitable work in the villages was the additional duty that the position of Duchess required. There were perhaps 15 villages on the Marlborough estate, with several thousand tenants, and the Duchess was expected to take an active interest in the welfare of the tenants visiting the school in Woodstock, attending the Christmas distribution at the church, calling on the families of estate workers who had fallen ill, and the ongoing work of the parish welfare that the Duchess of Marlborough was expected to lead. The evening, in the standard country house pattern, began with the dressing for dinner at perhaps 6 or 6:30. The dressing was the most elaborate dressing of the day. The Duchess of Marlborough at Blenheim in 1898, dressing for an ordinary family dinner with no guests, dressed in full evening costume, a long evening gown, with the appropriate evening jewellery, with the hair dressed in the formal evening arrangement. The full apparatus took perhaps an hour. Dinner was at 8. Even when only the Duke and Duchess were in residence, dinner was conducted in the great state dining room, with the table set for two at one end of the long mahogany surface that ran for perhaps 30 feet along the centre of the room, with the full silver service and the candles in the silver candelabra and the string trio that played from the gallery above for some weeks of the year when the Duke had decided that the evening music was appropriate. The dinner ran to perhaps 6 courses served by perhaps 4 footmen in the standard formal sequence of the era. The conversation at dinner, with only the Duke and Duchess present, was sometimes substantive and sometimes desultory. The Duke on most evenings was preoccupied with the political and estate matters of the day. The Duchess on most evenings was preoccupied with the weight of her position, which had not, after a year and a half of marriage, become any less heavy than it had been in the early days. The dinner took perhaps an hour and a half. After dinner, the Duke retired to the smoking room, which was his male preserve, and Consuelo retired to the drawing room or the sitting room that she had chosen as her own. She read, she wrote letters, she did needlework on the embroidery frame that the era's female accomplishments included. She played the piano on the upright piano in her sitting room. The Duke in the smoking room smoked his cigar and read the newspapers and conducted whatever business he chose to conduct in the hour after dinner. The two of them rejoined in due course in the drawing room for the late evening conversation that the protocols of the marriage required, and they retired separately to their respective bedrooms at perhaps 11. The day ended. This was the daily texture of Consuelo's life at Blenheim from 1896 onward. It was in its way an enormously privileged life. There were perhaps 15 women in the entire population of the British Empire who occupied a comparable position, and Consuelo's material situation was, by every reasonable assessment, among the most luxurious that the era was capable of producing. She had any number of houses. She had unlimited access to the great London social and political world. She had the resources to do, within reason, whatever she chose. She was, on the balance of any reasonable accounting, a woman of immense privilege. She was also, in the daily reality of her existence, profoundly unhappy. The unhappiness had several sources. The principal source, of course, was the marriage. The Duke continued, through the first decade of the marriage, to treat his wife with the formal civility that his upbringing required, and with no perceptible warmer feeling. He did not, in the daily exchanges of their married life, become any closer to her over time. He did not, in the evening conversations and the rooms and the accumulated occasions of the marriage's daily texture, begin to develop any deeper affection for her. He had married her for her money. He continued to be married to her because the marriage was, by the standards of the Anglican Church and the social conventions of the era, indissoluble. But he did not, by any visible measure, ever come to love her, and the daily evidence of his lack of affection was, for Consuelo, the principal weight of her position throughout the first decade of the marriage. There were additional sources of unhappiness as well. The cold I have mentioned, the constant low-level loneliness of being an American in an English position that had been carefully designed to admit no American particularity, the recurring tension between her own American directness and the indirection of the English manner, which produced, over time, a permanent low-level social discomfort that no amount of practice ever entirely removed, the distance from her family in America, the intermittent sense, when she walked through the great state rooms of Blenheim with their portraits of the previous 9 duchesses on the walls, that she was a temporary occupant of a position that had been occupied by other women for 2 centuries before her, and would be occupied by other women for centuries after, and that her own inhabitation of the position was, in the long sweep of the family's history, a footnote rather than a chapter. The biographers and the historians have, in their various accounts of these years, been not to overstate the unhappiness. Consuelo was not, in any clinical sense, in a state of permanent depression. She had, by the standards of her position, a great deal of work to do, the running of the household, the political work for her husband, the charitable work in the villages, and the work occupied her attention in ways that prevented the unhappiness from becoming overwhelming. She had her 2 children, whom she loved. She had the accumulation of acquaintances and friendships that the social world of the position eventually produced. She had her own private interests, her music, her reading, her gardening, that gave her some independent ground to stand on. She was, in summary, not a tragic figure in any continuous and overwhelming sense, but she was unhappy in the daily way that an unhappy marriage produces unhappiness. For the entire decade between 1896 and 1906, the unhappiness was the principal weather of her life. The story of these years would be, however, profoundly incomplete if I described only the unhappiness, because what Consuelo did with the unhappiness, the work she did to construct a meaningful life inside the cage, is one of the more interesting parts of her story, and it is the part that the popular memory of her case has tended to overlook. The Consuelo of 1900, when she was 23, was visibly a different person from the Consuelo of 1896, who had arrived at Blenheim at 18 as the broken daughter of a tyrannical mother. She had begun, in those 4 years, the methodical construction of an independent self that the next several decades would carry steadily forward. The construction took several forms. The first form was the political work. The Duke, by 1898, was beginning to develop the political career that the position of a senior English peer of its time encouraged. He had become, in 1897, a member of the Conservative front bench in the House of Lords, with an interest in colonial affairs. He had been appointed, in 1899, to the position of Paymaster General in Lord Salisbury's Conservative government, a relatively junior cabinet position, but a meaningful one, and the character of position from which a serious political career could in due course be built. He held the Paymaster General position for 3 years, until the Conservatives left office in 1902. The political work that the position required, the entertaining of the senior Conservative figures, and the foreign visitors and the various political intermediaries that the cabinet position involved, fell substantially to Consuelo. She was, accordingly, by 1899 and 1900, hosting at Blenheim and at the Marlborough family's London house in Curzon Street the political dinners that the Duke's career required. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she was good at it. She had a quick intelligence. She had the manner that political entertaining required. She had been trained in her childhood in 3 European languages, which gave her advantage in the diplomatic dimension of the political dinners. She had, most importantly, a genuine interest in the political questions that the dinners were addressing, and the private interest that she developed in the issues, the questions of social reform and of women's position that the early Edwardian period was beginning to surface, gave her independent intellectual ground to stand on within the formal apparatus of her position. The political ground became over the next several years one of the principal foundations of her independent life. By 1903 and 1904, she was developing a substantial reputation as one of the more interesting hostesses of political London. The dinners at the Curzon Street house were attracting attention. The conversations at the dinners were beginning to be reported in the private way that such things were reported in the era, in the political diaries and the memoirs of the participants. Consuelo was beginning to be, in her own right, a figure of some consequence in the political world. Not, of course, as an independent actor, since the position of women in the political life of the era did not admit independent actors, but as a hostess and as a private intelligence behind her husband's parliamentary career. The work was satisfying in ways that the daily texture of the marriage was not, and Consuelo invested in it with the determination that her childhood training had given her. The second form of the construction was the philanthropic work. The position of Duchess of Marlborough included by long tradition a set of charitable obligations that the Duchess was expected to discharge: the parish welfare work I have mentioned, the school in Woodstock, the distributions at Christmas. Consuelo discharged these obligations conscientiously, but she also began, by perhaps 1900, to extend the philanthropic work into areas that her own interests had identified. She developed interest in the conditions of women prisoners in the English prison system, which had been substantially exposed in the previous decade by various reformers, and which Consuelo, with the American directness that her childhood had given her, decided to investigate at first hand. She visited Holloway Prison, the principal women's prison in London. She spoke with the wardens. She wrote, in the private way that an aristocratic woman then could write, to various conservative figures about the reforms she thought were needed. She would in due course become a substantial public figure on the question of prison reform, and her work in this area would be one of the permanent achievements of her life. She extended the philanthropic work to the conditions of factory women. She visited the great mills of the industrial Midlands. She spoke to the women workers about their hours and their wages and their housing. She was, again with the American directness that her childhood had given her, surprisingly effective at extracting from the women the private accounts of their working conditions that the more deferential English ladies of the age had not been able to extract. She worked with various reforming organizations on the initiatives that the period was producing on women's working conditions. She would, in 1909 and again in 1910, give the public addresses on these questions that established her, in the specialized world of the social reformers, as a serious and committed participant rather than a fashionable amateur. The third form of the construction was the cultivation of an independent personal world that the marriage had not been able to absorb. Consuelo, by 1900, had developed a private circle of friends, mostly older women, mostly with their own private histories of difficult marriages, who had become, in the evening hours and the private weekends and the ongoing exchange of letters, the central emotional support of her life. There was the Duchess of Sutherland, the formidable Millicent Sutherland, who became one of her closest friends and who shared with her an interest in the social reform questions. There was Lady Curzon, the Vicereine of India, who was another of the great American dollar princesses of the previous generation, and who had married George Curzon and gone with him to India, when he was appointed Viceroy in 1898. Lady Curzon and Consuelo had been girls together in New York and Newport, and the reconnection of the friendship in their adult years was one of the significant relationships of Consuelo's life. There was the Duchess of Devonshire, the older and more formidable Louise Cavendish, who was a useful patron for Consuelo's early political and philanthropic work. There were various other private friendships with women in similar positions that gave Consuelo the ongoing emotional support that her marriage was not providing. There is an additional dimension of Consuelo's Edwardian transformation that I want to spend a moment with, because it is one of the concrete pieces from the period that most modern readers can directly encounter. In 1905, the great American portrait painter John Singer Sargent was commissioned to paint a substantial group portrait of the new Marlborough family. Sargent, who was at the height of his career and who was producing in those years the major society portraits that have made him the principal visual chronicler of the Edwardian upper class, came to Blenheim for several weeks in the autumn of 1905 to conduct the sittings. The painting, which was completed in 1905, shows the Duke and Consuelo standing together with their two sons at the foot of the great staircase at Blenheim. The Duke is in the dignified pose that the position required. Consuelo is standing behind and to one side of him, in a long evening gown of pale rose silk, with a substantial set of pearls. The two boys, John and Ivor, are in front of their parents, John on his father's side, Ivor on his mother's. The composition was deliberately modelled on a Reynolds family portrait of the previous Marlborough generation that hangs elsewhere in the palace, and Sargent's painting was intended, as great country house portraits operated, to take its place in the long sequence of family portraits that the saloon at Blenheim contained. The painting hangs at Blenheim today, in the Red Drawing Room. It is one of Sargent's better Edwardian group portraits. It is also, on closer inspection, a subtle commentary on the marriage it depicts. The Duke's expression is correct but distant. Consuelo's expression is composed but reserved. The two of them are positioned in the same frame, but they are not in any meaningful sense in contact with each other. The two boys, who occupy the central portion of the painting, are the visible link between their parents, the two figures whose existence the marriage had been contracted to produce. Sargent, who was observer of his sitters, had painted the marriage as he had found it. The other substantial Edwardian project that I want to mention is the renovation of Blenheim itself, which was conducted in the years roughly 1900 to 1910 with substantial Vanderbilt money. The Duke, who had married Consuelo in part to obtain the means to restore the palace, used the dowry over the course of the marriage's first decade to fund a substantial program of restoration and improvement that the palace had badly needed. The principal architect of the renovation was the French landscape designer Achille Duchesne, whom the Duke commissioned to design the great Italian water terraces that descend from the western front of the palace down to the lake. The water terraces, which are one of the most photographed features of Blenheim today, were constructed between 1908 and 1925 in two principal phases, with the upper terrace completed in the years before the war and the lower terrace in the years after. The whole program of renovation extended also to the interior of the palace, with the restoration of various of the staterooms, the installation of modern plumbing and electrical systems, and the substantial improvements to the family's living quarters that the wealth Consuelo had brought made possible. The palace, by the closing years of Consuelo's marriage, was in considerably better physical condition than it had been at the time of her arrival in 1895. The Vanderbilt money had, in this sense, served the purpose for which it had been paid. The Duke's financial calculation in agreeing to the marriage had been vindicated. Whether the marriage itself had been worth the cost is of course a different question. There was, additionally, a friendship that I want to mention, which was Consuelo's friendship with King Edward VII. The friendship developed in the Edwardian way that royal friendships developed after Edward's accession to the throne in January 1901. The king had known Consuelo since her marriage and had taken an avuncular interest in her welfare by the fact that the king occasionally did with the younger married women of the senior peerage. The friendship was in its essence a social one. Consuelo was by 1903 and 1904 a regular guest at the private weekends that the king held at Sandringham and at the various country houses where he stayed during the season. She was placed at his table for dinner at the Buckingham Palace events. He spoke to her in the private conversations that the friendship permitted with the attention that the London gossip duly noted. The relationship was, by every contemporary account, entirely proper. The king was older than Consuelo. His attention was that of a benevolent sovereign rather than a romantic suitor. But it was a substantial friendship, and it was useful to Consuelo in the Edwardian way that royal favour was useful in confirming her position in the social world and in providing her with an additional source of support that the difficulties of her marriage made valuable. The fourth form of the construction, and the one that most interests me as I look back around the years, was the development of Consuelo's own self-awareness and self-knowledge. She had come to England at 18 as a substantially conditioned young woman whose principal experience of life had been to do what her mother required. She had come to maturity by her late 20s into a woman who had begun to develop, in the interstices of the marriage and the position, a clearer sense of who she was independent of the various roles that had been imposed on her. The development was slow. It was, in many particulars, painful, but it was real, and the Consuelo of 1905, at 28, was visibly more her own person than the Consuelo of 1895, at 18, had ever been permitted to become. The marriage was a cage, but the cage had, in the private way of these things, contained within it the becoming that produced, eventually, the woman who would in due course walk out of the cage and into the rest of her life. The marriage itself throughout these years was steadily deteriorating. The Duke's affections, never strongly engaged with Consuelo to begin with, became increasingly engaged elsewhere. There were, by the early 1900s, several private relationships that the Duke was conducting with various women in the private world of the English country house circuit. The relationships were, by the standards of the era, conducted with reasonable discretion, and they were not in any meaningful sense the cause of the marriage's failure. The marriage had failed at its inception, and the Duke's private relationships were a consequence of the failure rather than a cause of it. But the relationships were, by 1903 and 1904, an additional daily reality of Consuelo's life that she had to manage. The most consequential of these relationships, when it eventually developed, was the Duke's involvement with a young American woman called Gladys Deacon, and the Gladys Deacon affair is sufficiently consequential that I want to spend a focused passage on it. Gladys Deacon was, in many ways, an even more extraordinary figure than Consuelo herself, and the history of her involvement with the Duke is one of the more astonishing side stories belonging to that world. Gladys Deacon was American, born in 1881 in Paris to expatriate American parents, whose marriage had ended in a dramatic manner. Gladys's father had, in 1892 in Cannes, shot her mother's lover in a celebrated trial that had made the private affairs of the Deacon family the subject of intense newspaper coverage. Gladys had grown up, accordingly, in the unsettled European life that the family's notoriety had produced. She had become by her late teens one of the more remarkable beauties of her generation, with the shape of physical presence that produced, in the various men who encountered her, an unusual degree of fascination. She was also extraordinarily intelligent and extraordinarily well-read, with an interest in classical literature and philosophy that the group of intellectuals who became her friends found genuinely impressive. She was, in summary, the sort of young woman whom the European intellectual society of the early 20th century occasionally produced, and her name was by 1900 well known in the private circles of the English and French upper classes. The Duke met Gladys Deacon, by the various accounts, at some point in 1899 or 1900. The encounter was, in the way of the era, described as a friendship of the sort that the Edwardian aristocracy regularly conducted between married men and unmarried young women. By 1901, the friendship had become something more substantial. By 1902 and 1903, it was understood, in the private way that the senior English society understood these things, that the Duke was substantially in love with Gladys Deacon, and was conducting with her a relationship that the formal protocols of his marriage did not, on the strict construction, permit. The relationship was, by perhaps 1904, an open secret in the Edwardian circles in which all the parties moved. Consuelo, of course, was aware of it. She would, in her later memoir, describe her response to it with the reserve that her memoir generally maintained. She did not, she said, find herself distressed by the Duke's involvement with Miss Deacon, because the marriage had not, by the time of the involvement, contained any substantial affection that the involvement could have damaged. The relationship was a fact. She incorporated it into her understanding of the marriage and continued with the daily work of her own life. The Duke and Gladys Deacon's relationship would continue, with various interruptions for the next 20 years, and it would become, eventually, the second marriage of the Duke after his eventual divorce from Consuelo. We will come, in due course, to the strange and tragic later life of Gladys Deacon, who would marry the Duke in 1921 and become the second wife of the 9th Duke of Marlborough, and whose subsequent decline into mental illness and reclusiveness would make her one of the more tragic figures of the interwar English upper class. But for the purposes of the present chapter of Consuelo's story, the Gladys Deacon affair is the event that pushed the Marlborough marriage past its final breaking point and produced, by 1906, the formal separation that ended its working life. The separation of 1906 was, in how aristocratic marital separations of the era were arranged, a private agreement between the parties that was not formally publicized, but that was understood by everyone with any knowledge of the situation to mark the end of the marriage as a working partnership. The Duke would continue to live at Blenheim. Consuelo would relocate to the family's London house in Curzon Street. The two of them would maintain, for public purposes, the fiction of a continuing marriage. They would appear together at the necessary state functions. They would coordinate the public dimensions of their respective lives. But they would not, in any practical daily sense, function as husband and wife. The two children, John and Ivor, who were 9 and 7 respectively, would divide their time between the two parents according to a private arrangement that the parents had worked out. The eldest, John, who as Marquess of Blandford was the heir to the dukedom, would spend the bulk of his year at Blenheim with his father, in the preparation for the position he would in due course inherit. Ivor would spend more of his time with his mother in London. The boys would in this sense be raised with the awareness that their parents had separated, and that the daily reality of their family had become permanently divided. Consuelo, in her memoir, wrote about the separation with the reserve that her account of her own painful experiences habitually employed. The separation had been, she said, the necessary acknowledgement of a fact that had been true since the wedding day. It had been arranged with the maximum of mutual courtesy that the difficult circumstances permitted. It was not, on her side, a source of distress, although she was conscious of its consequences for her sons. The years between the separation in 1906 and the formal divorce in 1921 are, in some sense, the years of Consuelo's productive middle life. She had, by 1906, the effective freedom that the separation had given her. She could live her own life in London, manage her own household, pursue her own interests, develop her own friendships without the daily friction of the failed marriage. She was, by the technical standards of the Anglican Church and the legal conventions of the era, still married, and remarriage was not, for the duration of those years, an option that was open to her. But within the constraint of the technical marriage, she had, for the first time since her childhood, the practical freedom to direct her own daily existence. She used the freedom, by every contemporary account, well. The political work continued. The philanthropic work expanded. The intellectual life that she had been developing in the previous decade now became the principal occupation of her years. She read extensively. She wrote, for various reformist publications, the articles on social questions that her position permitted her to publish. She worked in increasing collaboration with various reformers and politicians on the concrete legislative initiatives that the social reform movement of the late Edwardian era was producing. She became, by 1910 and 1911, one of the recognizable figures of the substantive political and reformist world of London. She was no longer, in the public perception of the era, principally Consuelo Vanderbilt, the unhappy heiress who had been forced into the Marlborough marriage. She was Consuelo Marlborough, the Duchess who had become a serious participant in the work of social reform. Her cause, in these years, became the question of women's suffrage. The British suffragette movement had, by the years 1909 and 1910, reached its period of greatest public activity. The Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughters Christabel and Sylvia, was conducting the campaign of civil disobedience that had brought the question of women's voting rights into the centre of British political life. The various other suffrage organisations, the more moderate National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies led by Millicent Fawcett, the various smaller groups were conducting their own campaigns of petition and lobbying and public meeting. Consuelo, by 1909, had aligned herself with the moderate constitutional wing of the movement, and she became, by 1910 and 1911, one of the substantial aristocratic supporters of the cause. She gave speeches, she wrote articles, she used her position and her connections to place the question before audiences that the more militant wing of the movement was unable to reach. She did not, by every account, agree with the militant tactics that the Pankhurst wing was employing. She thought they were counterproductive, but she was committed to the goal that all branches of the movement shared, and her work in support of the goal was in the specialized assessment of the historians from that era, a substantive contribution to the eventual achievement. The eventual achievement, of course, would not come until 1918, when the Representation of the People Act gave the vote to British women over 30 who met certain property qualifications. The full equal franchise would not come until 1928. But the long campaign that produced these results was substantially the work of the years 1908 to 1918, and Consuelo's participation in the campaign during those years was one of the more substantial contributions to the cause from within the senior English aristocracy. Ulrich was noted big respect. The years between the separation and the war 1906 to 1914 were, in addition to the work I have described, the years in which Consuelo's friendship with various European intellectuals and reformers became substantial. She was by these years on cordial terms with George Bernard Shaw, with H. G. Wells, with various of the senior figures of the liberal political establishment, Asquith, Lloyd George, Edward Grey. She had, in her London house, a substantive salon that drew, on any given week, a serious mixture of political and intellectual figures. She was reading widely. She was thinking carefully. She was in the accumulating way that intellectual development occurs in any thoughtful person who applies themselves to it over time, becoming a more interesting person. She was also, in the private way of these years, beginning to develop the friendship that would in due course become the second marriage of her life. The friendship was with a French aviation pioneer called Jacques Balsan. Balsan was, in the years before the war, one of the more prominent figures of the French aviation community that had emerged in the years following the Wright brothers' first flights of 1903 and 1905. He was a member of a wealthy French textile manufacturing family whose interests had given him the financial freedom to pursue his various enthusiasms. He was, by the years of the early 1910s, perhaps in his early 40s, he had been born in 1868, which made him roughly 9 years older than Consuelo. He had been, in his earlier years, an army officer and then a balloonist. He had been one of the early licensed aeroplane pilots of France. He had been involved with various of the early French aviation pioneers in the design and construction of the first generation of practical aeroplanes. He was, in the specialized society of the French aviation pioneers, a substantial figure. He was also, in the private assessment of those who knew him, a man of unusual personal qualities, kind, intelligent, courteous, with a European cosmopolitanism and a genuine interest in the people he encountered. Consuelo had first met Balsan in the social circuit of the European wealthy in the years before the war. The first meeting was at some point in the early 1900s, the exact date is uncertain, and the two of them had moved over the next decade in the overlapping social world that the wealthy of its time inhabited. By 1912 or 1913, the friendship had become a substantial one. They corresponded regularly. They saw each other when their respective travels in Europe brought them to the same place. The friendship was, in the way of the era, a friendship rather than a romance. Consuelo was still technically married to the Duke of Marlborough, and Balsan was a man of European propriety who would not have permitted any open development of the friendship into something more under those circumstances. But the friendship was, in some real sense, the private foreshadowing of what would in due course become the central relationship of the second half of Consuelo's life. The two of them, even in the protocols of the years before the war, recognized in each other the companionability that no other friendship of either of their previous lives had quite produced. The recognition would be available to be acted on when the constraints of Consuelo's marriage were eventually removed. For the present years, however, it remained a friendship. The First World War, when it came in August 1914, transformed Consuelo's life along with the lives of everyone else in her generation. The transformation, in her case, took several forms. The first was the immediate work that the war demanded. Consuelo, like many of her aristocratic English contemporaries, threw herself into the substantial volunteer work that the early months of the war required. She helped organize the conversion of various country houses into convalescent hospitals for wounded officers. She worked with the various refugee organizations that the early Belgian refugee crisis of 1914 produced. She visited the wounded in the London hospitals. She worked with the Red Cross. The volunteer work was, in the way of the war work that the women of the senior aristocracy did, both substantial and largely unrecorded, and the various accounts of Consuelo's work in those years are based on the surviving fragments of her correspondence and the brief mentions in her later memoir. The Belgian refugee work-in deserves an additional moment of attention. The German invasion of neutral Belgium in August 1914 had produced, by the closing months of that year, a refugee population in England of perhaps 250,000 Belgian civilians who had fled the fighting and the German occupation. The Belgian refugees were, through how early war refugees often are, both an object of great public sympathy and a substantial practical problem of housing and welfare and employment. Consuelo, with her position and her resources, became one of the substantial English organizers of the Belgian refugee work. She helped coordinate the placement of refugee families in private English houses. She funded, from her own resources, the substantial relief efforts that the early months of the work required. She visited the various reception centres and housing arrangements that the work produced. She was in the specialised assessment of those who worked alongside her in the Belgian refugee organisations, one of the more effective and committed participants in the work, bringing to it the American directness and the determination that her earlier social reform work had developed in her. I want to spend a moment with the character of this war work, because it is the concrete expression of the type of person Consuelo had become by 1914. She was, by the outbreak of the war, 37 years old. She had, by then, perhaps 15 years of substantial philanthropic and reformist work behind her. She knew the institutional landscape of London charitable work, where 15 years of substantial engagement produces. When the war came, she did not need to learn how to do anything new. She simply applied the existing skills and the existing networks to the new emergency. Her London house in Curzon Street became, in the autumn of 1914, one of the substantial coordinating centres for the Belgian refugee work that the early months of the war required. The house was given over, for several months, to the intensive work of receiving refugees, finding them temporary accommodation, organising their medical and material needs, and connecting them with the longer-term arrangements that would carry them through the duration of the war. Consuelo, who had been raised speaking French and who could converse comfortably with the Belgian refugees in their own language, was effective in the interview work that the refugee processing required. She personally interviewed, by the various estimates, hundreds of refugees in the autumn of 1914. She personally arranged accommodation for many of them. She drew on the extensive network of English country houses that her position made available to her, and she persuaded a number of friends and acquaintances to take in refugee families for the duration. The concrete result of her individual work in those months was, by every reasonable estimate, the practical resettlement of perhaps several hundred Belgian refugees who would otherwise have been considerably more difficult to place. The hospital work, which extended throughout the war, was the other major dimension of her wartime engagement. She converted Sunderland House, the substantial London house that had been built in the early years of the marriage with her dowry money, into a working military hospital that operated for the duration of the war. The hospital provided beds for perhaps several hundred wounded officers over the course of its operation. Consuelo was personally involved in its administration and worked, on most days when she was in London, in the practical administrative role that the operation required. She visited the wards. She corresponded with the families of patients. She arranged the comforts that the convalescing officers required. The work was, by every account of those who observed it, conducted with the competence and the genuine warmth that her years of philanthropic experience had developed. She was not, in any of this, a fashionable amateur. She was a substantial working participant in the war effort, as her position permitted her to participate. The second form of the transformation was the loss. The First World War killed, by the standard estimates, somewhere close to 1 million British servicemen, and the casualties fell with weight on the senior English aristocratic families, whose sons were disproportionately commissioned as junior officers in the units that bore the heaviest casualties. The Marlborough family, in this respect, was extraordinarily lucky. Both of Consuelo's sons survived the war, John serving with distinction in the Royal Horse Guards, and Ivor serving with the Royal Navy. But the extended circle of Consuelo's English friends and connections lost, between 1914 and 1918, a substantial proportion of their sons and brothers and cousins. The Duchess of Sutherland's son was killed. Various of the political circle who had attended the Curzon Street dinners did not return. The whole social world that Consuelo had constructed over the previous 15 years was, by 1918, a substantially diminished thing with the permanent gaps in it that the war had produced. She would, in the years after the war, write to friends about the strange experience of attending dinners at houses where the missing chairs had not yet quite been absorbed into the seating plan, and where the conversation occasionally lapsed into the reflective silence that the absence of certain voices produced. The third form of the transformation was the final clarification of her own marital position. The Duke, during the war, had been substantially absent from London. He had taken up, in 1914, a military appointment that kept him on staff duties for the duration. Consuelo had been entirely in London. The two of them, by 1918, had not lived under the same roof for 12 years. The marriage was in any working sense over, and had been for more than a decade. The Duke, in the private discussions that occurred toward the end of the war, indicated that he was prepared, when the post-war legal and social conditions permitted, to seek a formal divorce. The divorce, when it came, would allow him to remarry. The remarriage, as the Duke had been making increasingly clear since 1916 or so, would be to Gladys Deacon, with whom he had been substantially involved for the previous 15 years. Consuelo, on her side, raised no objection. The formal divorce would also free her, although the prospect of her own remarriage was at this point not yet a settled question. She and Jacques Balsan had been corresponding throughout the war. Balsan had served in the French Air Force with distinction throughout the conflict, and the two of them had, by 1918, an understanding that I will describe more fully in due course. But the immediate point in 1918 was that both Consuelo and the Duke wanted the formal end of the marriage that had effectively ended in 1906. The formal civil divorce was finalized in 1921. The Marlborough marriage was, after 26 years of formal existence and 15 years of separated existence, legally dissolved. The Duke remarried Gladys Deacon in June 1921, almost as soon as the divorce was final. Consuelo, after a brief interval, remarried Jacques Balsan on the 4th of July 1921 in a private ceremony in London that was attended only by close family. She was 44 years old. The first marriage had occupied her from 18 to 44, the entire central span of her adult life. The second marriage was about to begin. I want to spend a moment with the second marriage, because the second marriage is the part of Consuelo's story that the popular memory of her case has tended most thoroughly to overlook, and because it is the part that gives the entire arc its proper resolution. The first marriage was the famous part, the forced wedding, the crying behind the veil, the unhappy decade at Blenheim, and the famous part has accordingly been the part that the popular accounts have tended to dwell on. But the second marriage was, by every measure, the more significant part of her life. It lasted 35 years. It was, by the unanimous testimony of everyone who knew the couple, profoundly happy, and it was the marriage in which Consuelo, after 26 years in the cage that her mother had built, became at last who she had always had it in her to become. Jacques Balsan was, in 1921, 53 years old. He was a man of medium height, slender, with a military bearing that his army training had given him. He had a French moustache. He had, by every contemporary description, a form of face that registered as friendly and intelligent and humorous. He was a Catholic by birth and conviction, although not devout. He was a Republican, in the French sense of the term, with a strong commitment to the principles of the Third Republic. He was extraordinarily competent in his various technical interests. He had, by 1921, been involved in French aviation for nearly 20 years, had served as a pilot and an officer in the war, and was considered by his colleagues in the French aviation industry one of the most knowledgeable practical authorities on the technical questions that the early aviation period was raising. He was, in addition to the technical interests, a man of considerable cultural cultivation, a serious reader, a competent amateur in music and the visual arts, a traveller. He was in summary a version of man whom Consuelo had probably needed all her life, and whom her mother's program had prevented her from finding earlier. The marriage between Consuelo and Jacques was, from its first day, an entirely different kind of marriage from the first one. Jacques loved Consuelo. Consuelo loved Jacques. The mutual love was not, in any romantic novel sense, the principal thing between them. Then was the companionability that two intelligent and thoughtful people can produce when they have found each other in middle age and recognized in each other the qualities that no other person of their previous lives had supplied. They liked each other's company. They were interested in each other's interests. They could, on any given evening, sit together for hours in the pleasant silence that comfortable couples produce, or talk for hours about the subjects that interested them both. The marriage was, in this sense, the great success that the first marriage had so spectacularly failed to be. The Balsans established themselves in two principal residences. The first was the Château Le Souel at Izé, a 16th-century castle on the cliffs above the Mediterranean coast between Nice and Monaco, that the Balsans purchased and renovated in the early years of the marriage. Le Souel was by every account one of the pleasures of Consuelo's adult life, a beautifully positioned house, with views down to the sea and across to the Italian coast, with the gardens that Consuelo developed over the next decade, with the daily life that the Riviera permitted in the years between the wars. The house had been built originally as a fortified farmhouse in the 16th century, and the renovation that the Balsans conducted in the early 1920s preserved the original stone walls and the medieval interior arrangement, while adding the modern conveniences that the Riviera life required. Consuelo, with her training in the great country house traditions of England, applied to Le Souel the skills of the country house chatelaine, the arrangement of the gardens, the thoughtful furnishing of the rooms, the management of the household. The Garden Inn became, over the years of the marriage, one of the most admired Riviera gardens then, a series of terraced beds descending the cliff toward the sea, planted with the combination of Mediterranean and English plants that the climate permitted, with the reflecting pools and the walks that the design required. The second residence was the Château of Saint-Georges Motel in Normandy, which the Balsans purchased somewhat later, and which became their principal French country residence. Saint-Georges Motel was a 16th-century chateau in a more substantial setting than Le Souel, with a large park and substantial gardens, and the character of neighbourhood role that the French nobility of the surrounding country expected of their senior families. The chateau had been built originally for the Knights of Malta in the 16th century, and had passed through various hands before the Balsans purchased it in the late 1920s. Consuelo, in her capacity as the chatelaine of Saint-Georges Motel, played the role with the competence that her years at Blenheim had given her. She was, by every account of the local witnesses, a beloved figure in the surrounding country. She founded on the estate a substantial children's hospital that provided medical care for the children of the local agricultural workers. She funded the parish welfare initiatives that the French rural communities required. She conducted, through the years of the interwar period, the shape of substantial philanthropic work in the surrounding country that her position permitted, and that her own developed instincts inclined her to. The daily texture of the Bolson marriage is worth a moment's attention because it is the evidence of what the second life actually consisted of. Jacques was, by temperament, an early riser. He would, on most mornings, be up by 6:30, and would spend the first 2 hours of the day in his study, working through the technical correspondence that his various aviation and engineering interests continued to generate well into his later years. He was, throughout the marriage, in continuing correspondence with the various French aviation pioneers and engineers who had been his colleagues in the years before the war, and with the new generation of aviation figures whose work he followed with the attention of an earlier participant in the field. The morning study hours were, accordingly, a fixed feature of the daily pattern. Consuelo, who was less of an early riser than her husband, would generally come down to the breakfast room at perhaps 8:30 or 9, and would attend to her own correspondence in the private hours of the morning that her domestic schedule permitted. The two of them came together for the late morning, which was their principal companionable interval of the day. They would, depending on the weather and the residence, walk in the gardens or drive in the open car that Jacques kept at each of the houses for the private excursions that the married life included, or simply sit together on whichever terrace or sitting room the day's conditions had chosen. They talked. The conversations between them, as both of them recorded in various private letters that survive, were one of the principal pleasures of the marriage. They talked about books they were reading, about the political events of the day, about the concerns of the various friends and relatives whose lives they were tracking, about the running questions of their own household and gardens and various interests. The talk was, by every account that has come down to us, the sort of inexhaustible, companionable talk that very compatible couples produce, which can occupy hours on any given day without ever quite running through its available subjects. The afternoons, in the standard Bolsan pattern, were given over to the individual occupations that each of them pursued. Jacques had his various technical and engineering interests, which the interwar French aviation industry continued to provide. He was also, by his late 50s and 60s, an accomplished amateur photographer, and the photographic record of the Bolson marriage, which various of the biographies have used as illustrations, is substantially Jacques' own work. Consuelo had her gardens, her correspondence, her writing, the philanthropic work that the French residences required, and the intellectual life that her continuing reading produced. The two of them, in this sense, gave each other the considerable freedom to pursue their own interests, with the daily intervals of companionability that the marriage's structure provided. The evenings were the second principal companionable interval. Dinner was served at perhaps 7:30, in the intimate way that the second marriage had developed, usually in a dining room rather than the great formal one, with 2 or 3 courses rather than the elaborate sequence that Blenheim had required. After dinner, the two of them would adjourn to the library or the drawing room. They read separately, but in the same room. They discussed what they were reading. They listened occasionally to music on the gramophone that Jacques had installed in each of the houses. Jacques had a love of French 19th century music, and Consuelo had developed in her years in England a fondness for the English choral tradition. The evening passed with the accumulating peace that the second marriage produced as its reliable daily output. They retired, generally, at perhaps 11. The day ended. This was the daily texture of the second marriage from 1921 onward. It was in its way the evidence of what a satisfactory marriage actually consisted of, and the contrast it provided to the first marriage was the permanent reason that the second marriage was, by every measure of Consuelo's own assessment, the central achievement of her adult life. There were, in addition to the French residences, the continuing connection with America, Consuelo retained, throughout the second marriage, her American property, the substantial estate at Sands Point on Long Island that her father had given her in his will. The Bolsons spent perhaps several months of each year in America in the annual rotation that the second marriage developed. Consuelo's mother, Alva, who had remarried after the death of William Kissam Vanderbilt and was now Mrs. Oliver Belmont, was still alive in the early years of the second marriage. The relationship between mother and daughter, after the catastrophe of the first marriage and the private resentment that the catastrophe had produced, had developed into something more complex and ultimately more complete than the simple obedience and control relationship of Consuelo's earlier life. We will come, in due course, to the remarkable closing of the relationship between Alva and Consuelo, which occurred in the years between 1924 and Alva's death in 1933, and which represents one of the more interesting acts of late-life acknowledgement that the period produced. The remarkable closing began with the Catholic annulment of 1926. The annulment, which is one of the more curious side stories of the entire Marlborough affair, requires explanation. Consuelo, in her marriage to Jacques Balsan, had married a Catholic. The Catholic Church does not recognize civil divorce as a basis for the dissolution of a sacramental marriage, and Consuelo's first marriage to the Duke of Marlborough, although it had been an Anglican ceremony rather than a Catholic one, was nevertheless considered by the Catholic Church to have been a valid sacramental marriage between two baptized Christians. The civil divorce of 1921 had ended the legal marriage in the eyes of British and American civil law, but it had not ended the marriage in the eyes of the Catholic Church. Consuelo's marriage to Jacques Balsan was, accordingly, in Catholic terms, the marriage of a divorced woman whose previous husband was still living, and was not therefore a valid Catholic marriage. The Balsans had been married only in a civil ceremony, since the Catholic Church would not have performed the wedding under the prevailing circumstances, and the irregularity of their position with respect to the Catholic Church was a recurring difficulty in their daily life in the French Catholic society in which Jacques moved. The irregularity could be regularized, however, if the Catholic Church could be persuaded to issue an annulment of Consuelo's first marriage on the grounds that the first marriage had not, in fact, been a valid sacramental union. The grounds for annulment in Catholic law are and limited. One of the recognized grounds is force or coercion. If a marriage has been entered into not by the free consent of both parties but under coercion or duress, the marriage is not, in Catholic terms, a valid sacramental union, and an annulment can be issued declaring that the marriage was from its origin null. The grounds applied, on a reading of the actual circumstances, almost perfectly to the Marlborough marriage of 1895. Consuelo had not consented freely. She had been coerced by her mother, by methods that were extreme even by the standards of the era. The marriage had been, in the strict Catholic theological sense, not a valid sacramental union, but a coerced contract. The annulment, on these grounds, could in principle be issued. The application for the annulment was filed with the Catholic ecclesiastical authorities in 1926. The application required, as part of the standard process, the collection of evidence about the circumstances of the marriage. The principal evidence had to come from the parties to the marriage themselves, and from the persons who had been present at the time of the events. The most consequential single piece of evidence, accordingly, was the testimony of Alva Vanderbilt Belmont, who was the only person in a position to confirm or deny the coercion that the application alleged. Alva, by 1926, was 73 years old. She had, in the years since the catastrophe of 1895, gone through her own substantial transformation. She had, in 1895, been the engine of the private tyranny that had produced her daughter's misery. She had in the decades since become an increasingly prominent figure in the women's suffrage movement, funding the cause, marching in the parades, founding organizations, dedicating substantial financial resources to the long campaign for women's voting rights. The transformation on the private level represented Alva's own working out of certain questions about women's autonomy that her treatment of Consuelo in 1895 had raised in their most acute form. She had, in some sense, spent the next 30 years working out what she had done and arriving at a different position from the position from which she had done it. When the application for the annulment came to her in 1926, Alva did the unexpected thing. She testified, in writing, in a sworn deposition that the application required, that she had indeed coerced her daughter into the marriage. She described in some detail the methods she had used. She described the threats. She described the isolation. She described her daughter's resistance and the breaking of the resistance. She did not, in the deposition, attempt to defend her actions or to soften the description. She simply gave, on oath, the substantially accurate account of what had happened in 1894 and 1895. The deposition, when it was filed with the ecclesiastical authorities, was the central piece of evidence on the question of coercion. The annulment on this evidence was granted in 1926. The annulment is in some ways the most remarkable single fact in the entire story. The mother who had spent 14 months breaking her daughter's spirit in 1894 and 1895 had 30 years later gone on the record under oath to acknowledge what she had done. The acknowledgement had no immediate practical purpose for Alva. She gained nothing from making it. The acknowledgement had a substantial practical purpose for Consuelo, who could now have her marriage to Jacques Balsan recognized by the Catholic Church and could remove the persistent irregularity from her position. But the acknowledgement was also, in some sense, the private act of Alva's late-life moral reckoning with what she had done. The 30 intervening years had given her time to think. She had, for substantial portions of those 30 years, been a leading public advocate for the proposition that women should be free to direct their own lives. She had, in the application for the annulment, been asked to give testimony that bore directly on whether her own treatment of her own daughter had been consistent with the proposition she had been publicly defending. She gave the testimony. The evidence supported the conclusion that the proposition required her to acknowledge. She acknowledged it. The annulment was granted. The relationship between mother and daughter, after the annulment of 1926, entered the final reconciled phase that occupied the closing 7 years of Alva's life. The two of them did not become close in any romantic novelistic sense. Too much had happened between them, and the permanent damage of the years from 1894 to 1906 was not the type of damage that could be undone by a late-life acknowledgement. But they could now, after 1926, sit in a room together with the comfortable understanding that the central matter between them had been openly addressed. They corresponded. Consuelo visited Alva in New York during the Balsans' annual visits to America. Alva visited the Balsans at Lou Suelle and St. George Motel during her own European travels. The relationship became, in its final form, something like the relationship between two adult women who had once had a difficult earlier history, and who had now, in their respective late years, arrived at a mature accommodation. Alva died on the 26th of January 1933 at her house in Paris at the age of 80. Consuelo was at her bedside for the final illness. The relationship that had governed the first 30 years of Consuelo's life ended, finally, in the private peace that the late-life reconciliation had produced. The years between the annulment of 1926 and the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939 are, in some sense, the years of Consuelo's flourishing. She was, by 1926, at the age of 49, in the middle of her second marriage. She had, in the years since the marriage to Jacques Balzan in 1921, settled into the rhythm of a life that suited her in every way that her first marriage had failed to suit her. The Balzans divided the year between St. George Motel and Luxeuil, with the annual visits to America and the incidental travels to other European places that the wealthy life of the interwar period permitted. Consuelo, in this period, did not reduce her engagement with the public causes that had become her serious work. She continued in France to support a number of charitable initiatives. She funded a substantial children's hospital at St. George Motel, and she was actively involved in the French agricultural and rural welfare initiatives that her position in the country gave her access to. She continued to be a substantial financial supporter of various women's rights and educational organizations on both sides of the Atlantic. She also, in these years, began the private work that would eventually become her memoir. The work was slow. She was not, by training, a writer, and the prose of her published account took her, when she eventually committed to writing it, several years to develop. But she was by perhaps 1930 beginning to assemble in her own mind the account of her own life that she would, 20 years later, publish in The Glitter and the Gold. The assembling was not initially intended for publication. It was the private working through of a life that had now reached the age at which a thoughtful person begins to look back on what has happened and to attempt to understand it. Consuelo, in the private hours that the second marriage permitted her to spend in this kind of reflection, was beginning to construct the version of her own story that would in due course become the canonical account. The two sons of the first marriage, John and Ivor, were by these years grown men with their own established lives. John, the elder son, who had been the heir to the dukedom, had succeeded his father as 10th Duke of Marlborough in 1934 on the death of the 9th Duke. He had in the years before that been an active military officer in various peacetime units, had married in 1920 the daughter of an English peer, and had developed his own established position within the senior English aristocracy. The relationship between John and his mother was, by the years of his adulthood, a substantial one. Consuelo had remained a presence in his life throughout the years of the separation and the second marriage, and the affection between them was real if somewhat reserved by the conventions of their respective positions. The 10th Duke would in due course become the public head of the Marlborough family, would be a substantial figure in the interwar Conservative establishment, and would die in 1972, having lived through the substantial transformations of the Marlborough position that the 20th century would produce. Ivor, the younger son, had developed a more independent and somewhat less conventional life. He had served in the Royal Navy in the war, had then taken up a career as a businessman with various interests in finance and industry, had married twice, and had become, in his adult years, a substantial figure in the smaller intellectual and artistic circles of London society. He was, in this respect, more like his mother in temperament than his elder brother was. The relationship between Ivor and Consuelo was, by every account, the closer of the two mother-son relationships, and Ivor remained throughout his life in close contact with his mother through the years of her two marriages and her various transitions. There were, in the years 1926 to 1939, the various deaths that the long lives of substantial people accumulate. Consuelo's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, had died in 1920 at the age of 70. The 9th Duke of Marlborough, Consuelo's first husband, died in 1934. At the age of 62, his marriage to Gladys Deacon, which had begun with such expectation in 1921, had collapsed by the late 1920s into a form of severe unhappiness that ended Gladys Deacon's social existence and produced the prolonged tragic decline of her later years. Various of Consuelo's English friends and connections from the years before the war had died in the 1920s and early 1930s. The world in which her first marriage had been conducted was, by the mid-1930s, a substantially diminished world with the permanent gaps in it that the passage of time and the war had produced. The world that the Bolsons had constructed in France, however, was the flourishing world of the interwar French upper class at its most substantial. Loose Whale and St. Georges Motel were, in the years between the wars, two of the more cultivated and most pleasant houses in France. The Bolsons entertained, on a substantial but not extravagant scale, the overlapping circles of the French and the European wealthy that the Riviera and the Norman countryside contained. There were the various aviation pioneers and engineers whom Jacques had known throughout his career. There were the writers and artists whom both the Bolsons had known in the substantive intellectual society of interwar Europe. There were the political figures of various nationalities whom Consuelo's position and Jacques' connections combined to bring to their tables. There was, in the accumulating way of these things, a substantial cultural and social life that was, by every contemporary account, one of the more agreeable establishments of the interwar French and European wealthy. The Bolsons were not in any of this ostentatious. The substantial wealth that Consuelo had retained from the original Vanderbilt fortune, and that Jacques had brought from his own family, was, in the interwar years, deployed quietly. The houses were beautiful but not extravagant. The entertainments were generous but not vulgar. The accumulating evidence of the second life that Consuelo had constructed for herself was, in this respect, the expression of a personality that had become, by the years of her late 40s and 50s, more confident and more comfortable in itself than the personality of her younger years had ever been permitted to be. She was, in summary, finally herself. The cage had been opened. The second life was real. I want to spend a moment with the daily texture of the second marriage, because the daily texture is the part of it that distinguishes it most clearly from the daily texture of the first marriage, and that, in the accumulating way of these things, makes the difference. The day at St. George's Motel began, for the Bolsons, at perhaps 8 in the morning, when their respective valets and ladies' maids brought morning tea and ran the baths. Breakfast was at 9, in the breakfast room that opened onto the formal garden, and the two of them took breakfast together. This was in itself a substantial difference from the first marriage, in which the Duke had habitually taken breakfast in his dressing room and had not appeared in the family rooms until after 10. Jacques came to breakfast. He was present. He was glad to see her. He asked her about her plans for the day and told her about his own. They read the morning papers, the French papers from Paris, the English papers from London, the American papers that arrived several days late, and discussed, in the way of two intelligent people who shared their political and cultural opinions in substantial detail, the daily news of the world. The breakfast lasted perhaps an hour. The morning was given over, in the alternating pattern that the Bolsons had developed, to each of their respective occupations, Jacques to his aviation correspondence and his business interests, Consuelo to her own correspondence and her philanthropic work and the ongoing management of the household. The two of them rejoined for lunch at 1, and lunch, like breakfast, was a substantial daily institution of their shared life. The afternoon, in good weather, often included a walk together in the gardens, or a drive in the motor car that Jacques enjoyed, or a visit to one of the neighbouring families. The evening, like the morning, was conducted together. They dressed for dinner, but not in the elaborate full evening costume that Blenheim had required when only the Duke and Duchess were in residence. They dressed in the comfortable evening clothes that the second marriage's more relaxed standards permitted. Dinner was at 8. They sat together at the table, not at opposite ends of a 30-foot mahogany surface, but at adjacent corners of a smaller round table that the Bolsons had had installed in the private dining room they used when they were alone. They talked. They had, by every contemporary account, never run out of things to talk about along the entire 35 years of the marriage. The dinner lasted perhaps an hour and a half. Afterward they sat together in the drawing room, and Jacques read aloud to Consuelo, a daily institution that he had begun in the early months of the marriage, and that had continued for the next 35 years. He read her French novels. He read her the historical works that they were both interested in. He read her the classical texts that her education had given her the appreciation for. The reading lasted perhaps an hour. They retired, together, at perhaps 11. The day ended. The accumulated detail of this daily texture is, in the way of these things, the most concrete evidence of the difference between the first marriage and the second. The first marriage had been the marriage of two people who occupied the same establishment but did not, in any meaningful sense, share their daily lives with each other. The second marriage was the marriage of two people who occupied the same establishment because they wanted to share their daily lives with each other. The institutions of the second marriage's daily life, the breakfast together, the lunch together, the dinner together, the evening reading aloud, were the concrete expression of the fundamental fact that the two of them preferred each other's company to any other company they might have arranged. The fundamental fact, when accumulated throughout the 35 years of the marriage, produced the substantial happiness that the marriage was, by every contemporary account, the substantial vessel for. The outbreak of the Second World War in September 1939 began the next great interruption of Consuelo's life. The war, in its early months, did not disturb the Bolsons. France was at war with Germany, but the French sector of the front was substantially during the period of the drôle de guerre, the so-called phony war of late 1939 and early 1940. The Bolsons were in residence at St. Georges Motel through the autumn and winter of 1939, with the heightened wartime conditions that the war footing required, but with no immediate threat to their position. The calculation that any thoughtful person would have made about the future of France in the spring of 1940 was that France would, as in 1914, hold the Germans on the eastern frontier, and that the war would in due course be conducted as a long defensive struggle of the kind that had been conducted in the previous war. The calculation was wrong. The German offensive of May 1940, which broke through the Ardennes and around the northern end of the Maginot Line, produced the catastrophic French collapse of May and June. By the second week of June, the German armies were sweeping across northern France. By the middle of June, Paris had fallen. By the 17th of June, the new French government under Marshal Pétain was suing for an armistice. By the 22nd of June, the armistice had been signed. France had been defeated in 6 weeks. The previous calculation about the war's likely duration had been catastrophically wrong, and the substantial life that the Bolsons had built at St. Georges Motel and Loos Swale over the previous 19 years was by the closing days of June 1940 no longer tenable. The Bolsons, like many of the senior figures of the French upper class, made the calculation that the German occupation of France would be incompatible with the continuation of their previous lives. They were not, by any of the standard wartime classifications, in immediate physical danger. They were neither Jewish nor communist, nor active in the early resistance, the categories that the German occupation authorities were initially most interested in, but they were of a generation and a class for whom the daily realities of life under German occupation were, by their political and personal convictions, intolerable. They would not stay. They would, somehow, leave. The escape, in the narrow window of opportunity that the closing days of the unoccupied zone provided in the late summer of 1940, was a version of operation that the period required. The Bolsens went south, by car, through the temporarily unoccupied zone that the Vichy government technically administered. They reached Spain with various papers that the last-minute preparations had assembled. They crossed Spain to Portugal. From Portugal they took a ship to America. The whole journey took perhaps 6 weeks. The Bolsens arrived in New York in the autumn of 1940. They settled initially at Consuelo's Long Island house at Sands Point, and would in due course establish their American household principally at the Bolsen house in Palm Beach, Florida, with the Long Island house as the summer residence. Consuelo was 63, Jacques was 72. The European life that the marriage had been built around was over. The remaining years of the marriage would be conducted in America. The American years, from 1940 to 1956, were the closing years of the marriage. They were, by every account, peaceful and pleasant. The Bolsens had the substantial financial resources to conduct an entirely comfortable American life. They had the network of family and friends that Consuelo's connections in America provided. They had, in the accumulating routine of the war years and the early post-war years, a pleasant existence that was, in its own way, the American counterpart of the French life they had left behind. There was the house at Sands Point, with its garden and its Long Island social world. There was the house at Palm Beach, with its winter seasonal social life. There was the ongoing engagement with various American causes. Consuelo continued, into her late 70s, to be a substantial supporter of various educational and women's organizations. There was the continuing engagement with her sons in England, who visited periodically, and with her grandchildren, who were by these years growing up and becoming young adults of their own. Jacques Balsan died on the 4th of November 1956 at the Palm Beach house at the age of 88. He had been, in his closing years, in declining health, and the death was not unexpected. But it was, for Consuelo, the central loss of her adult life. The 35-year marriage that had been the second great chapter of her existence ended. She was 79 years old. She was a widow for the second time, having survived now both of her husbands. She had, ahead of her, 8 more years of her own life to conduct. The 8 years between Jacques' death in 1956 and Consuelo's own death in 1964 were the years in which she conducted, with the determination that her long life had developed, the final tasks of her own existence. The principal of these tasks was the publication of her memoir. The memoir had been, as I mentioned earlier, the private working of nearly 25 years. Consuelo had begun the process of assembling her account of her own life in the early 1930s, at first as the private reflection that her own thoughtful late middle age had begun to require, and then by perhaps the late 1940s as the more deliberate project of preparing a published version. She had worked on the manuscript through the war years and the early post-war years. She had, by 1950, a substantial draft. She had worked on it intermittently in the intervals of her American life, with the editorial assistance that her American publisher provided. She had, by 1952, the version that she was prepared to publish. The The book was published in October 1952 by Harper and Brothers in New York and by Heinemann in London under the title The Glitter and the Gold. The title was taken from the phrase that the publisher and Consuelo had agreed on as the most appropriate summary of the book's principal subject. The contrast between the surface glamour of Consuelo's life as a dollar princess duchess and the underlying reality that the surface glamour had often concealed. The book ran to perhaps 350 pages in its principal edition. It was reviewed extensively in both the American and the British press. It was by every measure of its commercial success a substantial bestseller. It was reprinted in the year following publication in something like a dozen editions. It was translated into French, German, Spanish, and several other European languages. It became, by the years immediately after its publication, the standard primary source for everything that has subsequently been said about the Marlborough marriage and about the dollar princess phenomenon in general. It was, in summary, the definitive literary product of Consuelo's long life. The book is, by the standards of memoir writing in any era, an unusually good one. It is well written in a clear prose that betrays no obvious editorial assistance, and that suggests, throughout, the intelligence of its author. It is extraordinarily restrained. The catastrophe of the first marriage is described, but not in the character of inflammatory detail that a less self-disciplined writer would have produced. Alva is treated with the generosity that the late-life reconciliation between mother and daughter had made possible. Consuelo describes what her mother did, but she does not condemn or psychologize or vilify. She simply describes it, and lets the reader make of it what the reader will. The Duke of Marlborough is treated with the same generosity. The various other figures of the various phases of her life are described with affection or with reserve as appropriate, but never with the shape of private revenge that the long life of an unhappy first marriage might have permitted. The book is, in this respect, the literary expression of a personality that had, by the time it was written, achieved the mature equilibrium that the events it describes had once threatened to destroy. It is in a sense a deeply Christian book, in the sense that it embodies the charity toward those who have done one harm that the Christian tradition makes the central moral discipline of mature life. Consuelo, in writing the book, exercised the charity toward her mother and her first husband, and the various other figures who had caused her difficulty, and the book bears the permanent evidence of the discipline. The book also, in its way, became the central documentary source for the version of Consuelo's life that the world subsequently received. Almost everything that has been written about her in the 70 years since the book's publication is based, directly or indirectly, on the account that the book provides. The various biographers who have written about her in the decades since, and there have been several substantial biographies, have generally accepted the account as substantially accurate, with the qualifications that any historian would apply to a memoir written 60 years after some of the events it describes. The book is, in this sense, the canonical version of her life, and the version that any subsequent account must, in some way, work with or against. The remaining years after the publication of the memoir were the final years of her widowhood. She continued to live in the alternating pattern that the Bolsons had developed between her Long Island house and her Palm Beach house, with the visits to the various surviving members of her family that the late-life pattern of her existence permitted. She remained in correspondence with her two sons in England, with the 10th Duke at Blenheim, in particular, whom she had visited several times in the post-war years, and whose own life had become a substantial Marlborough position in its own right. She remained in correspondence with the various of her old French and English friends who had survived the war and the long subsequent period. She remained, in the way of the long-lived elderly of her class and era, a substantial correspondent. The daily output of letters in the copperplate hand that her education had given her was one of the permanent features of her closing years. She died at her house on Long Island on the 6th of December 1964. She was 87 years old. She had outlived her mother by 31 years, her first husband by 30 years, her second husband by 8 years, her father by 44 years. She had outlived almost all of the friends of her younger life. She had, in some sense, outlived the entire world that her childhood had been conducted in. The final hours of her life were spent in the peace that her long-prepared character had earned. She died, by every account of those who were present, quietly and without distress. The funeral arrangements that she had specified in her will were unusual, and they are, in some sense, the final statement of her own self-understanding. She did not wish to be buried in America. She wished in her express instruction to be buried at Bladen, the village churchyard at the edge of the Blenheim Park, beside her elder son John, the 10th Duke of Marlborough, who had died in 1972, although since John was still alive at the time of Consuelo's death, the express instruction was that she be buried in the plot at Bladen that would in due course also receive him. The choice of Bladen is, when you think about it, the unexpectedly poignant final note of the entire story. Bladen is the village churchyard of the parish that contains Blenheim Palace. It is the parish church in which the Marlborough family has, for 2.5 centuries, conducted its parish religious life. It is the churchyard in which the various members of the Marlborough family have been buried for those same 2.5 centuries. Consuelo, who had been the Duchess of Marlborough for 26 unhappy years, who had spent the better part of her adult life trying to escape the position the marriage had given her, who had eventually achieved the second marriage that had been the real centre of her life, who had outlived the Duke and the second husband and the substantial portions of the world they had inhabited together, was choosing at the end to be buried where the Marlborough family was buried, and to be commemorated as the woman who had for those 26 years been the Duchess of Marlborough. The unexpected reconciliation that the choice represented is, in some sense, the final theme of the entire story. Consuelo had not, by the choice, withdrawn the reasonable judgments she had made about the catastrophe of the first marriage. She had not, by the choice, indicated that the marriage to the Duke had been anything other than what she had always understood it to be, but she had, by the choice, acknowledged that the position the marriage had given her was in some real sense part of who she had been, and that the final identity she had constructed over the long course of her life included, among its other elements, the history of having been for 26 years the Duchess of Marlborough. The position that her mother had purchased for her in 1895 had been, after all, her own to inhabit. The position what she had made of it. The position had been, after all, part of the permanent shape of her own existence. To be buried at Bladen was, in this sense, the late-life acknowledgment of the position rather than its repudiation. She was buried, accordingly, at Bladen. The grave is, in the village churchyard, perhaps 20 yards from the church, and adjacent to the group of graves that constitute the Marlborough family burials of the 20th century. Her grave is marked by a simple stone with the inscription Consuelo Vanderbilt Bolson, with the dates of her birth and her death. The stone does not mention the dukedom. The stone gives her name as the name of her second marriage, the name of the marriage that had been, by every measure of her own self-assessment, the central marriage of her adult life. the Duchess of Marlborough is buried in this sense, in the place where the Duchess of Marlborough belongs, but with a stone that names her by the name she had wanted to be known by, which was the name Jacques Bulson had given her. I want to spend, before we close, some time with the larger meaning of the life we have walked through. The life is, in its way, one of the most representative cases of a historical phenomenon, and the representative quality of it gives the individual story a larger significance than the individual story alone would carry. The phenomenon, as I described in our opening, was the trade in Anglo-American marriages between roughly 1870 and 1914, the 300 or 400 marriages between American heiresses and European, principally English, aristocrats that the conjunction of the new American wealth and the declining European aristocratic fortunes had produced. The phenomenon was, in itself, a specialized episode in the history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and the various individual marriages that constituted it had varying outcomes that the popular memory has tended on the whole to flatten. Some of the marriages were happy, some were tolerable, some were unhappy, a number were catastrophic. The popular memory has tended to remember the catastrophic ones, and particularly the Marlborough marriage as the most prominent of them, as if they were the typical case, when in fact the typical case was somewhere in the middle range of the distribution. But the Marlborough marriage, while not typical of the trade in its outcome, was in some sense typical of the trade in its mechanics. The same conditions that produced it, the wealthy, ambitious mother, the financially distressed aristocratic family, the young woman with no effective veto over her own future, the substantial financial settlement, the church wedding, the relocation to the European country house, were the same conditions that produced the rest. The variation in outcomes depended on the individual factors of the personalities involved. Where the personalities happened to mesh, the marriage worked. Where they did not, the marriage failed. The forced quality of the original arrangement was, in this sense, less important to the eventual outcome than the popular memory has sometimes suggested. Many of the forced marriages worked out perfectly well. Many of the apparently consensual marriages were, on closer inspection, only nominally consensual, with the same substantial pressures from family and circumstance that the forced ones operated under. The category of forced versus consensual, in the social conditions of the era, was less binary than the modern reader sometimes assumes. What made the Marlborough marriage catastrophic was, in some sense, the conjunction of personalities. The Duke was reserved, formal, and incapable of spontaneous warmth toward a person he had married for money. Consuelo was sensitive, intelligent, and had been raised in a household whose own emotional climate had been substantially cold. The two of them, when they were brought together in 1895, were almost exactly the wrong combination. Two people who would have needed considerable warmth from each other to overcome the original difficulties of their position, and who were both temperamentally unable to provide the warmth that the other required. The marriage failed because the marriage had been, from its inception, an emotional impossibility. The various other contributing factors, the financial considerations, the social considerations, the Duke's eventual involvement with Gladys Deacon, were the consequences of the original impossibility rather than its causes. What then did Consuelo's life mean? What does the long arc of her existence from the brownstone in 1877 to the grave at Bladen in 1964 actually tell us about the world she inhabited and about the individual question of what a person can do with a life that has been so thoroughly shaped by forces outside her own control? The answer that her life seems to me to suggest is, in the way of these things, an answer that is more interesting than either of the simpler answers that her case might at first seem to point toward. It is not the answer that the cage was complete and the daughter was destroyed. It is something in between. The cage was real. The daughter was substantially shaped by the cage in ways that she could not, by any effort of her own, undo. But the cage also contained, in its own interior architecture, the unintended materials from which the daughter was eventually able to construct the second life that the cage had not anticipated. Consuelo, in the years of her unhappy first marriage, developed the political competence and the philanthropic engagement and the intellectual cultivation that the position of Duchess of Marlborough had unintentionally provided the conditions for. When the cage opened, she carried these things out with her. The second life she built, the marriage to Jacques Balsan, the substantial work in France and America, the gradual maturation into the woman she eventually became, was built in part with materials that the first life had unintentionally given her. The cage had been intended as a cage. It had functioned in some real sense as a cage, but it had also been, in its own unintended way, a school for the person Consuelo would in due course become. The relationship between Consuelo and her mother is in some sense the encapsulating image of this larger pattern. Alva had been, in 1894 and 1895, a private tyrant who had broken her daughter's spirit. She had also been, in the years after, the public advocate of women's autonomy whose own actions had so spectacularly contradicted the position she came to hold publicly. The contradiction was, in Alva's eventual late-life acknowledgement, the private grief of her own old age. The acknowledgement, when it came in 1926, did not undo the catastrophe of 1895. But it did, in some real sense, complete the moral arc of the relationship, and it did make possible the reconciled relationship of the closing 7 years of Alva's life. Mothers and daughters, the Consuelo story seems to suggest, are not in any simple sense either reconciled or estranged. They are, in the long run, the working out of the inherited difficulties that one generation passes to the next, with the final adjustments that each generation has the chance to make in the closing years of its own existence. Alva and Consuelo had, between them, perhaps the most complicated mother-daughter relationship that the historical record of the age preserves. They worked it out, slowly and imperfectly and incompletely, over the course of the entire 79 years that Alva was alive after Consuelo's birth. They did not, by any measure, achieve perfect reconciliation. They did, in the late-life accommodation that the annulment of 1926 made possible, achieve enough that the relationship could be carried, in some completed form, into Consuelo's old age. The Dollar Princess phenomenon itself, in the final assessment that Consuelo's life invites us to make, was perhaps neither the institutional triumph that its defenders sometimes claim it to have been, nor the institutional catastrophe that its critics sometimes argue. It was, like most large social phenomena involving large numbers of people across long periods of time, a complicated mixed thing. It produced some genuinely happy marriages. Jenny Jerome's marriage to Lord Randolph Churchill, for all its difficulties, produced Winston Churchill, who would have a large effect on the history of the next century. Mary Leiter's marriage to George Curzon was, by every account, a profound love match that ended only in her tragic early death. Frances Work's marriage to a member of the Roche family produced, 2 generations later, Princess Diana of Wales. The phenomenon produced in the mixed way of these things both the mature happy marriages and the catastrophic unhappy ones, with the various intermediate cases distributed in the wide space between. It also, in the structural way of these things, was an intermediate stage in a longer transformation. The American wealth that the Dollar Princess marriages were dispensing was the wealth of a country that was by the closing decades of the 19th century beginning to overtake Europe as the principal economic power of the world. The European aristocratic position that the marriages were buying was the position of a class that was, in the same period, beginning the long economic and political decline that the next century would deepen. The trade was, in this sense, a transitional phenomenon, a marriage market that operated in the brief historical window between the moment when American wealth first became substantial enough to be of interest to European aristocrats, and the moment when European aristocratic position ceased to be of sufficient value to be worth the expense of acquiring. By 1914, when the war began the acceleration of the European transformation, the trade was substantially over. The world it had operated in was already, by then, in the early stages of its disappearance. Consuelo's life, in the way of an exceptionally long-lived person, spanned the entire arc of the trade and the world that produced it. She was born in 1877, near the beginning of the trade's history. She was at the center of its most famous case in 1895. She lived through its end in the war years between 1914 and 1918. She lived through the interwar period in which the world that had produced the trade was being transformed beyond recognition. She lived through the Second World War, which destroyed the European wealthy world more or less completely. She lived into the post-war American century, in which the last remnants of the world she had been born into were finally absorbed into the different world that was succeeding it. She died in 1964, at the end of the long historical arc that her life had spanned. I want to leave you with the final image that I think captures her best. It is not the image of the wedding day at St. Thomas Episcopal Church in November 1895, although that is the image that the popular memory of her case has tended to fixate on. It is not the image of the great Duchess of Marlborough at Blenheim in the early years of the 20th century, although that is the image of her most prominent public position. It is the image of the cottage at Loos-Suel on the Mediterranean coast. In some afternoon of the years between the wars, let us say an afternoon of perhaps 1928 or 1929, Consuelo is in her early 50s. Jacques Balsan is in his early 60s. The two of them are sitting on the terrace of the cottage, looking out through the garden and the cliffs to the Mediterranean. They have had their lunch together. They have spent the morning each in their own occupations. Jacques with the technical correspondence that his continuing involvement in French aviation generated, Consuelo with the social and philanthropic correspondence that her own continuing engagements required. They have come together in the early afternoon for the companionable hour that the second marriage had developed as one of its daily institutions. They are reading, each of them, a book. They are not speaking. They do not need to speak. The sea breeze comes up over the garden. The accumulating warmth of the Mediterranean afternoon settles into the bones of them both. The companionable silence between them is the thing that the second marriage had achieved that the first marriage had never even approached. They sit. They read. The afternoon passes. The great success of Consuelo's adult life is, in the unstated way of these things, present in the companionable silence on the terrace. The cage is gone. The daughter is 52 years old. She is, finally, exactly where she needed to be. The story I have walked you through tonight is one of the great life stories of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It is the story of a woman whose life began in a position of immense privilege and immense constraint, who suffered the catastrophe of having her central life decision made for her at 18 by a mother whose ambitions overrode her daughter's wishes, who endured the consequences of the catastrophe for 26 years, who escaped from the consequences when the erosion of her position eventually permitted her to escape, who built the second life that the first life had unintentionally prepared her for, who lived to be 87, who wrote one of the great society memoirs of the 20th century, who outlived most of the world she had known, and who was buried by her own express wish at the edge of the great park, whose palace she had once been the unwilling duchess of. The life is long. The life is, in its way, complete. Sleep well. Consuelo Vanderbilt Bolzen is buried at Blyden, in the village churchyard at the edge of the Blenheim Park, beside her elder son, the 10th Duke of Marlborough. Her stone gives her name as Consuelo Vanderbilt Bolzen. Her dates are 1877 to 1964. The accumulated facts of the long life have been, in the way of these things, deposited in the permanent record that the historians and the biographers and the readers of memoirs continue to consult. The cage is opened. The daughter is at peace. The world that produced the story of her life is gone. The story remains. I will see you in the next one.